Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly back to the year 1837, a moment when the air itself seems charged with anticipation. You can almost feel the weight of centuries shifting as an 18-year-old girl with dark eyes and a posture that looks both fragile and unshakably stubborn steps forward to become queen. You're standing there in London, soot curling in the early morning air, hearing church bells echo like a city's heartbeat, and realizing the whole stage of history is tilting beneath your feet. She's tiny, barely 5 feet tall, but she will reign for more than 60 years, long enough for the world you think you know to melt into something entirely new. And you, dear listener, are right in the thick of it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, drop a comment with your location and the local time. You'd be surprised how many insomniacs form this global midnight club. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step into the year with hesitant feet, noticing how the cobblestones gleam under gas lamps. The young Victoria, who suddenly finds herself queen after her uncle William IV's death, is both excited and terrified. Imagine yourself in her shoes. You're barely an adult, everyone around you calls you Your Majesty, and they're already whispering about your marriage prospects as if that matters more than your crown. Historians still argue whether she truly wanted the throne or just longed for independence from her overbearing mother, the Duchess of Kent, who had kept her under strict supervision since birth. Either way, she takes the throne with a straight spine, and the empire watches like nervous theatregoers at the opening act. Coal dust drifts into your lungs because the Industrial Revolution is already in full swing, shaping everything around you. You see chimneys stretching like grey fingers into the sky, trains belching steam as they slice across once quiet fields, and factories buzzing like hives. The people, they look half in awe, half exhausted. This is a world where a simple weaver finds his life replaced by humming machines, and while the rich sip brandy in glowing parlours, the poor cough into handkerchiefs in alleys that never see the sun. Here's a quirky tidbit. When Victoria ascended, she insisted on moving into Buckingham Palace immediately, though the plumbing was so bad that courtiers joked it was basically a glorified drafty hotel. You picture her tripping over damp carpets, tugging at heavy drapes and thinking, well, this isn't exactly the fairy tale castle I was promised. You, strolling through this era with your dreamlike awareness, hear gossip swirling. People are speculating about this girl queen. Can she hold her own against Parliament? Will she be manipulated by ministers? Or will she turn into some stiff puppet draped in jewels? They don't know yet that this shy teenager will stubbornly impose her own will, arguing fiercely with her advisors, sometimes sulking like any headstrong teenager, sometimes stunning them with political instincts sharper than they expected. Everywhere you turn, you sense beginnings. The steam engine hums, new social classes are rising, and inventions spark daily. You walk past a printing shop where newspapers shout about her coronation, their type still smudged with fresh ink. A paperboy hollers, his cap too big for his head. "Long live the Queen!" You almost laugh because his voice cracks halfway through. That's your first small joke of the night. Reality often stumbles when it tries too hard to sound grand. The coronation itself is almost theatrical. You slide into Westminster Abbey among nobles wearing outfits so elaborate they look like escaped birds of paradise. Incense stings your nose, trumpets blare too loudly, and the golden crown wobbles slightly as it's lowered onto her head. She grips the scepter like someone holding a very heavy umbrella. Even then, people argue whether she seemed regal or just frightened. Yet you catch that flicker of determination in her eyes, the same flicker that will define her entire reign. At this point you notice the odd contradiction of the age. Horse manure still piles up in streets, choking the air. Yet humanity is building machines that can outrun storms. That tension will be your companion through the whole Victorian journey. It's like wearing a top hat while riding a rocket. Impressive, but slightly absurd. As the first years of her reign unfold, you overhear debates in smoky coffee houses. Should Britain expand its empire further? Should Parliament loosen its grip on the poor? People talk with big gestures, knocking cups over as if caffeine fuels not just their bodies but the very progress of society. Someone mentions that railroads are the arteries of a new age, and you smirk, knowing they're right, but also imagining some poor farmer cursing at the shrieking iron beast ploughing past his cows. There's tenderness too. Victoria quickly falls in love with her cousin Albert, a man with a serious brow and an earnest passion for art and science. You lean in closer as letters pass between them. Awkward, shy, but warm. She calls him my angel, though sometimes he lectures her on politics like an overly enthusiastic university student. People later wonder whether Albert's influence made her wiser or just more stubborn. Historians still argue whether she ruled more effectively with him or whether his dominance frustrated her natural instinct. NCTs. The truth, probably both, and you smile at the messiness of it all. By now, your eyelids are heavy, but the narrative pulls you deeper. You wander through early Victorian London, where lamplight glows through fog thick enough to make you doubt your own footsteps. Vendors shout about fresh bread, and a man sells patent medicines that suspiciously taste like watered-down gin. You stumble past a church where hymns rise faintly, then hear laughter from a nearby tavern. That's life in this dawn, sacred and profane, majestic and mundane, all mashed together. You can almost hear the click of time itself as the Victorian era begins its march. A girl has become queen, the streets pulse with change, and you, dear listener, are standing right there, watching a history that feels both familiar and impossibly distant. You step back out into the streets of London, and the first thing that hits you is the smell, a pungent stew of horse manure, coal smoke and roasting chestnuts sold by a man with hands so blackened by soot you wonder if he's part chimney himself. It's 1837 still, the same dawn of Victoria's reign, but now you're slipping into the bloodstream of the city itself. The capital is alive in a way that feels overwhelming. Imagine Times Square, but without the neon and with significantly more mud. You walk slowly, letting your shoes clop over the uneven cobblestones. Gas lamps hiss faintly in the misty air, throwing halos of light around figures moving quickly. Clerks with leather satchels, maids balancing baskets, gentlemen in hats so tall they look like stovepipes searching for a stove. Somewhere a dog barks, though you're not entirely sure it isn't a human cough, because in Victorian London everything blurs together in the smog. As you trudge deeper, the soundscape grows. The rumble of carriage wheels clattering on stone, the sharp crack of a whip, and the cries of street vendors hawking everything from oysters to penny pamphlets promising cures for every ailment under the sun. One man is actually yelling, "Miracle pills, cure headaches, gout, and even heartbreak." You laugh softly, if only Tinder bios came with such guarantees. You catch sight of the River Thames, and here comes your reality check. It stinks. Not a romantic kind of salty sea breeze stink, but a full-on cover your nose and consider running stink. The river carries raw sewage, animal carcasses, and whatever else Londoners dump into it. Historians still argue whether the famous Great Stink of 1858 was the worst moment for the Thames, or simply the most politically embarrassing one. But either way, you realise this river is both lifeline and open sewer. It's unsettling, and yet somehow people adapt. Ways do. You drift toward a marketplace where wooden stalls creak under the weight of goods. Women haggle loudly over cabbages. A butcher swings a cleaver with alarming precision while a group of ragged children linger nearby, hoping for scraps. You spot a boy with bare feet. Despite the cold, his face smeared with ash. He darts in, snatches a discarded bone, and disappears into the crowd like smoke. That single scene sums up Victorian London. Wealth displayed openly beside desperation. In the wealthier districts, things look different. You stroll up Regent Street, marvelling at the wide thoroughfares designed by John Nash. Carriages glide past polished shop windows, and ladies in silk gowns glance nervously over their shoulders, afraid of pickpockets. The contrast between these polished avenues and the grimy alleys just a few streets away is staggering. You might compare it to flipping between Netflix profiles, one set to glossy period dramas, the other to gritty true crime documentaries. Here's your quirky tidbit for this stretch. In some London neighbourhoods, people actually kept pigs wandering the streets, not as pets, but as living garbage disposals. Imagine trudging home after a long day, dodging not just puddles but snorting pigs rummaging in the muck, and you thought your commute was stressful. As you wander further, you hear snippets of conversation drifting from coffee houses and pubs. Men debate politics with fiery gestures, puffing cigars that add another layer of haze to the air. One insists that railways will ruin the countryside forever. Another swears they will unite the nation like never before. Historians still argue whether industrialization truly improved daily life for the masses or whether it just shifted suffering into new shapes. You smile at the irony. These debates echo into your modern world too, where every technological leap brings the same mix of fear and hope. The street performers capture your attention next. A man with a monkey on a chain dances for coins, while an organ grinder cranks out a tune that sounds suspiciously like the Victorian version of an annoying pop earworm. A small crowd claps along, though half of them are clearly just trying to distract themselves from the smell of the gutters. You lean against a lamppost, watching, and almost nod off from the rhythm. Sleepy entertainment existed even here. You find yourself drawn into the East End, the side of London that polite society pretends not to notice. Narrow alleys twist like a labyrinth, laundry dangles overhead like tattered flags, and the air grows colder the deeper you go. You can hear children's laughter, but it's thin and sharp, the kind born more from survival than joy. Women lean in doorways, gossiping with voices roughened by gin. Men shuffle by, eyes hollow. You feel the weight of poverty pressing against you like damp fog. And yet, even here, life thrives. Street markets bustle with the trade of second-hand clothes, rusty tools, and questionable meat pies. Someone offers you a slice of eel pie for a penny, and you politely decline, though in truth you're tempted just to taste history. Fun fact, eels were cheap, plentiful in the Thames, and a staple for the working class. Historians still argue whether London's eel obsession was necessity, tradition, or just stubborn culinary masochism. At the edge of Whitechapel, you stumble across a gin shop. It's cramped, noisy, and smells like spilled spirits soaked into wood for decades. Men and women both drink hungrily, their faces flushed. Gin is nicknamed Mother's Ruin for a reason, cheap, strong, and devastating. You watch as one man stumbles into the street, laughing at nothing, while another collapses silently into his chair. Addiction has no era, it seems. As night falls, London changes again. Gas. Lamps flicker on, their glow softened by the thick fog that rolls in off the river. The city becomes a shadow play of silhouettes and whispers. A group of well-dressed gentlemen hurries past, canes tapping sharply, while a thief lurks in the darkness. Somewhere, a watchman's rattle clatters as he calls out the hour. You shiver slightly, though whether it's from the cold or the atmosphere, you can't quite tell. And then, because you deserve a lighter moment, a man with a top hat far too big for his head trips over a loose cobblestone and tumbles into a pile of hay. The horse tethered nearby flicks its tail at him in disdain. You chuckle quietly. Comedy survives everywhere, even in the grimiest corners of history. As you finally pause to breathe, you realize the streets of London are more than roads and buildings. They are veins pulsing with energy, contradictions, and stories. Every face you pass holds a secret. A maid dreaming of escape, a merchant chasing fortune, a child hoping for tomorrow. The city is alive, restless, and slightly absurd, and you, drifting through it, can't help but be pulled into its rhythm. London of the 1830s isn't glamorous. It's raw, uneven, and sometimes foul. But it's real, and it's the perfect stage for the era of Victoria, a city teetering between ancient habits and modern ambition. You walk a little further, your footsteps echoing, and you can feel the heartbeat of history pounding beneath the cobblestones, dragging you deeper into the century's unfolding story. You wander away from the foggy avenues and into the roar of something altogether different, the beating heart of the Industrial Revolution. The moment you step closer, the sound swallows you. It's a metallic symphony, clanging hammers, wheels grinding, pistons hissing like enormous steam-driven serpents. You feel the vibration in your bones, as if the earth itself has swallowed coal and is exhaling smoke through brick chimneys that scratch the sky. Inside the factories, light is scarce. Windows are filmed over with soot, and the air is thick, making each breath feel like inhaling a mixture of ash and damp wool. You trudge across floors slick with grease, ducking between spinning machines that look like monsters with endless teeth. The workers, men, women, even children, move with mechanical rhythm, hands darting dangerously close to whirring gears. You shiver, because you know one slip could mean disaster. And yet they keep at it, hour after hour, their bodies bent but their will unbroken. One mainstream historical fact slides into focus. By the mid-1800s, Britain had become the workshop of the world. Its factories pumped out textiles, iron goods and machinery at a pace that dwarfed rivals. The cotton industry alone exploded, with Manchester earning the nickname Cottonopolis. And here you are, practically choking on the lint floating in the air, realizing how progress feels when you can't even see through the haze. You notice a boy who can't be more than 8 years old darting between machines, sweeping up scraps of cotton before they cause fires. His little face is pale, his shirt torn, and his eyes carry that mix of exhaustion and determination you rarely see in children today. Quirky tidbit: factory owners sometimes hired kids specifically because their small hands could reach into places adults couldn't. Imagine explaining that in a job interview. Special sauce, kill, can squeeze between lethal iron parts without getting decapitated, usually. Some workers hum faintly, songs muffled beneath the grinding of machinery. Others are silent, too focused or too weary. Breaks are rare, and the meals? Bread, maybe cheese if they're lucky. A few workers sip from mugs of beer, because honestly, water isn't always safe. You think back to your own late-night snacks and suddenly your soggy cereal doesn't seem so bad. Historians still argue whether the Industrial Revolution truly improved quality of life for workers or simply transformed old miseries into new ones. Sure, wages inched up for some, but housing was cramped, disease spread easily, and safety regulations were laughably non-existent. You step outside the factory for fresh air, only to realize fresh here means another lungful of soot. Still, the workers file in day after day because the alternative, starving, feels worse. Beyond the factories, steam itself seems to crawl into every corner of Victorian life. You follow the trail of a locomotive screeching into a station. Trains are brand new beasts, symbols of both awe and terror. You watch passengers climb into carriages, some grinning with excitement, others clutching their seats like nervous cats. There's even a rumour, half joking, half serious, that moving at such speeds might cause the human body to unravel. A kindly gentleman reassures a lady that traveling at 30 miles per hour won't peel her skin off. You stifle a laugh, thinking how someone today panics when Wi-Fi drops for 30 seconds. The station is chaos. Steam clouds obscure faces, porters shout over each other, and luggage clatters as if alive. You hear a whistle so piercing you almost clap your hands over your ears. Yet despite the noise, there's an undeniable thrill. This is the sound of a world shrinking. Journeys that once took days can now be done in hours. Merchants salivate at the thought of quicker profits, while farm families tremble fearing the invasion of cheaper goods from far away. Here's another quirky aside. Early railway carriages didn't have roofs in some places, so passengers sat exposed to soot showers and the occasional flying ember. Picture yourself trying to look dignified in a top hat while your face is splattered with coal dust. Not exactly glamorous. Walking further, you stumble into an ironworks. The heat hits you like opening an oven door, except the oven here is the size of a building. Molten metal glows orange, flowing like a river of fire into molds. Sparks rain down, and the workers' leather aprons crackle under the bombardment. You wipe sweat from your brow even though you're not doing any work. One man shouts orders, his voice nearly drowned by the roar of bellows. You think of superheroes forged in flames, but this isn't fantasy. It's hard, punishing labour. Still, the products, rails, bridges, machines, reshape the very bones of Britain. Historians still argue whether Britain's dominance in iron and steel was inevitable, or whether it was a lucky accident of resources and timing. You glance at a pile of ore beside the furnace and shrug, maybe both. What's undeniable is that you're witnessing a society that's decided progress matters more than comfort. You wander outside again only to trip over a stray chicken darting between alleyways near the factory housing. Yes, chickens. Entire families cram into one-room tenements, sometimes sharing space with animals. The smell tells you everything you need to know about sanitation, or the lack of it. And yet out of this squalor comes innovation. New ideas, new machines, new visions of the future sprout like weeds through cracked stone. For a moment, you pause and look at the skyline. Chimneys rise higher than church steeples, pouring smoke into clouds that already look bruised. This is the age of industry, and the city wears its badge proudly, even if it means coughing through it. Pille le modes. Plea from the countryside flood in, chasing jobs, swelling the population until streets overflow. You sidestep a cart piled high with coal, its driver grumbling about potholes. The clop of hooves mixes with the hiss of steam, creating a rhythm that belongs only to this moment in history. And then, because history loves its little absurdities, you stumble upon a factory that claims to produce patent artificial leeches. Yes, leeches. Mechanical substitutes designed to replace the living ones used in medicine. You can't decide if this is horrifying, hilarious, or both. Imagine winding up a clockwork gadget and sticking it on your arm. Quirky? Absolutely. Practical? Well, let's just say historians still argue whether Victorians were geniuses or just dangerously creative. The deeper you go, the more you realize factories aren't just buildings, they're temples of a new faith. The faith of progress, of steam, of human ambition louder than reason. Workers bow their backs as if worshipping machines, and managers pace like priests guarding sacred rituals. You almost whisper, not wanting to disturb the liturgy of iron and fire. By the time you stagger back into open air, your ears are ringing, your clothes stink of coal, and your mind races. You've seen progress in all its raw, messy glory. It's impressive, terrifying, and slightly absurd all at once. The Industrial Revolution is not clean or polite. It's a thundering promise that the future will arrive whether you're ready or not. You glance once more at the factory chimneys stabbing into the night sky. They look almost like candles on a monstrous birthday cake, celebrating an age that doesn't care if you're comfortable. It just demands you keep up. And you, weary traveller, keep walking, letting the smoke curl behind you as you head toward whatever story the streets will tell next. You drift from the furnace roar of factories into a quieter, though no less unsettling corner of Victorian life, the world of childhood. If you've ever thought your school days were rough, brace yourself. In this century, childhood isn't bubblegum and cartoons, it's work, discipline, and survival. You walk down a cramped alley and see it clearly. Small bodies darting about, their hands raw, their eyes older than their years. Childhood here is shorter than the flicker of a candle in a draft. The first thing you notice are chimney sweeps. Boys no older than 6 scramble up blackened flues, their thin limbs twisting through shafts barely wider than your shoulders. You cough just watching them, soot falling like snowflakes onto their ragged shirts. A master sweep stands outside, pipe clenched in his teeth, shouting orders upward. You wince because you know these kids risk getting stuck, or worse. Some never make it out alive. Quirky tidbit: to encourage them, some masters lit a small fire beneath the flue. Talk about motivation by terror. Imagine your boss lighting your office chair on fire to meet deadlines. Productivity would skyrocket, sure, but so would panic. Historians still argue whether these boys were truly slaves to their masters or whether the practice was simply a grim necessity of the time. Either way, you watch a soot-covered face appear from a chimney top, eyes blinking through black dust, and you know no modern debate erases the reality. It's brutal. You wander further, spotting street children, urchins they're called, barefoot, clothes in tatters. They run in gangs, sharp as foxes and just as quick. One cheeky boy bumps into you, hand already reaching for your pocket. You catch him mid-motion and he grins, tooth gap wide, before darting away. You can't even be mad. He's playing the game of survival, pickpocketing, selling matches, sweeping crossings for coins. These are their daily gigs. And when night falls, many curl up under bridges or in doorways, their bellies rumbling. But not every child is on the street. You peek into a schoolhouse where rows of children sit stiffly at wooden desks. The air smells of chalk and damp wool. A teacher, cane in hand, dictates lessons with stern precision. Discipline builds character, he insists, though you notice more fear than inspiration in the children's faces. A boy drops his slate and the cane cracks down. You wince. Education in this era is as much about obedience as it is about learning. And here's your mainstream fact. The 19th century sees the beginning of widespread schooling in Britain, but it's patchy. The Education Act of 1870 eventually lays foundations for compulsory education, though many kids are still needed at home or in factories. Literacy rates climb, but at a cost of long hours and rigid methods. Picture sitting in class with no recess, constant memorization, and the threat of corporal punishment. Suddenly, your high school pop quizzes don't seem so cruel. You turn a corner into a workhouse, and here, childhood feels even heavier. Families too poor to survive elsewhere come here for food and shelter, but the price is harsh discipline. Children are separated from parents, drilled into routines, and set to tasks like stone breaking or oakum picking, pulling apart old ropes with bleeding fingers. The echo of small sobs lingers in the halls, though quickly silenced by the overseer's glare. The workhouse motto might as well be "Misery builds obedience." Quirky tidbit: children in workhouses were sometimes fed gruel so thin it looked like grey soup water. Charles Dickens wasn't exaggerating with Oliver Twist's "Please, sir, I want some more." Historians still argue whether the workhouse system was meant to reform the poor or simply to punish them for existing. You lean against the cold stone wall, and the answer seems clear. It punished, though society dressed it up as virtue. Outside, the city offers its own version of childhood. In parks, wealthier children play under the watchful eyes of nannies. You see little girls in frilly dresses, their curls bouncing as they skip rope, while boys launch hoops down paths. Their laughter floats sharp against the silence of poorer streets. The gap between classes shows early, even in playtime, and yet despite the divide, all these children grow within the same restless century, breathing the same soot-filled air. You wander into a home of the middle class, where childhood takes on a more sheltered form. Here, toys, tin soldiers, dolls with porcelain faces line shelves. Parents read fairy tales aloud by lamplight. You smile, thinking how bedtime stories survive across centuries, even if the morals are sometimes darker than a Tim Burton movie. Behave or witches will eat you doesn't sound quite like Dr. Seuss. Victorian parenting, though, is far from indulgent. Advice manuals stress duty, morality, and strictness. Parents are told not to spoil children with affection, lest they grow weak. You chuckle softly at the irony. Today's parents panic over too much screen time, while Victorians panicked over too many hugs. Some things never change. Parents will always worry they're doing it wrong. Night falls, and you trail a group of children trudging home from factory shifts. Their shoulders slump, their tiny boots scuffing the stones. One girl clutches a doll cobbled from rags, her only treasure. You feel a lump in your throat as you realize how different their nights are from yours. No cozy beds, no bedtime cartoons, just exhaustion and maybe a slice of bread. And yet, somehow, joy sneaks in. You hear children singing street songs, their voices high and cracked. The tunes are silly, often mocking adults, sometimes downright cheeky. One group teases a passing constable with a rhyme that makes you laugh. Dars. Despite yourself. Humour survives even in hardship. You remember that kid who tried to pick your pocket earlier. Somewhere, he's probably laughing too. Quirky fact for you, Victorian children sometimes played with toys made from dead animals, like stuffed frogs dressed in costumes. Yes, you heard that right. Taxidermy wasn't just for museums, it was a plaything. You shudder, picturing a tea party with a frog in a bonnet. Maybe that's where horror movies got their inspiration. Historians still argue whether Victorian childhood was uniquely harsh or just different by necessity. Some point out that child labour taught resilience, while others insist it robbed generations of innocence. The truth likely balances somewhere in the soot between. But as you look at their tired faces glowing faintly in the lamplight, you can't help but side with compassion. Childhood here feels less like a season and more like a fleeting privilege. Finally, you pause near a churchyard where children's laughter mixes with the toll of bells. Some chase each other among gravestones, unbothered by death's shadow. It hits you. In an age when disease could snatch lives quickly, children lived closer to mortality than you can imagine. Play and peril danced hand in hand. You sigh, letting the image sink into you. Childhood in the Victorian age isn't soft. It's work, fear, scraps of joy stitched together with resilience. You keep walking, soot on your coat, echoes of tiny footsteps in your ears, and a heavy awareness in your chest. In the dim light, you realize you've seen the beginnings of a generation that will grow up into inventors, writers, rebels, and dreamers. But for now, they're just children, clutching rags and bread, trying to carve out laughter in a world that demands too much too soon. You drift away from the bleak workhouses and ragged schoolyards, and soon the air changes. It smells faintly of polished wood, burning candles, and a whisper of bergamot tea. You've crossed the invisible line into wealth, into drawing rooms and parlours where aristocrats lounge in high-backed chairs and whisper scandal behind embroidered fans. Welcome to the side of the Victorian world where children are brushed clean, Corsets are laced tightly, and gossip flows as richly as the imported sugar cubes clinking into porcelain cups. You find yourself stepping into a grand townhouse along Grosvenor Square. The entrance hall is lined with marble tiles that echo beneath your boots, and a butler in immaculate uniform eyes you as if deciding whether you belong. Don't worry. You slip in unnoticed, blending into the hush of carpets and the low murmur of voices drifting from the parlour. You push open a door, and there it is, the stage where Victorian aristocrats perform their everyday theatre. A chandelier twinkles overhead, scattering light onto walls crowded with oil portraits. The fire crackles gently in the grate, though it's mostly symbolic. Real warmth here comes from wealth itself. Around a table, ladies in gowns of silk the colour of ripe plums gather, their skirts ballooning like oversized cupcakes. Gentlemen lean back in armchairs, canes propped nearby, waistcoats straining against indulgent meals. And in the centre of it all, the tea service, gleaming silver, pouring amber liquid that is less about refreshment and more about ritual. Mainstream fact. Tea time became a true institution in this era, thanks in large part to Anna, the Duchess of Bedford, who popularised the afternoon tea tradition. What started as her way of avoiding late afternoon hunger pangs turned into a full social event, complete with delicate sandwiches, cakes, and endless chatter. You picture her thinking, why starve between lunch and supper when we can invent a whole new meal? Admit it, you'd sign up for that logic in a heartbeat. One lady leans forward, voice dripping with mock sweetness as she whispers about someone's cousin caught gambling debts. Another counters with a tidbit about a neighbour whose daughter is rumoured to have run away with an unsuitable match. You suppress a chuckle. Victorian gossip is basically the original tabloid. Replace the carriages with sports cars, the drawing room with Instagram feeds, and you've got the same old cycle. Rich people entertaining themselves by talking about each other. Here's a quirky tidbit. Sugar cubes, which now dissolve silently into tea, were once a luxury so prized that guests sometimes carried their own in small decorative boxes called sugar nips. Imagine showing up to a Starbucks today with your own gold-encrusted sugar stash. Flex level, Victorian elite. Historians still argue whether this culture of endless tea and gossip was simply frivolous, or whether it provided genuine social glue, knitting together alliances and information networks among the upper classes. You sip quietly from an imaginary cup and lean toward the conclusion that it was both a way to bond, but also a way to keep everyone politely entangled in each other's business. Across the room, a piano tinkles, played by a young woman eager to display her accomplishments. You can almost hear her fingers stumble slightly, but the room still applauds. Music wasn't just art here, it was currency, proof that a lady was well-bred and ready for marriage. You smile at the irony. Centuries later, people still perform talents at family gatherings for approval, though now it's usually awkward karaoke instead of Chopin. You wander closer to the gentleman's corner, where cigars smoke lazily in the air. They talk politics in that vague way that signals to, hey, have already decided their opinions but still enjoy the sound of their own voices. One insists that empire expansion is the crown jewel of Britain. Another mutters about costs and risks. You sense their real concerns hover more around horse racing odds than parliamentary reform. Still, appearances must be kept. Out in the hallway, a servant girl carries a tray of fresh pastries, her head bowed. You watch her slip silently among the silk and cigar smoke, invisible despite being essential. The entire aristocratic stage depends on people like her, yet her voice is never heard in this parlour. That silence weighs on you even as the laughter grows louder. Now for a comedic break. One gentleman's top hat, left carelessly on a chair, is claimed by a mischievous lapdog. The tiny creature wiggles inside the enormous hat, turning the proud symbol of status into an absurd dog bed. You bite your lip to keep from laughing aloud. The ladies titter, and one remarks that the hat suits the dog better than its owner ever did. Score 1 for the canine class. You shift your gaze toward the tea table again. Small cakes, iced perfectly, sit untouched as conversations spiral. Some whisper about the Queen herself. Victoria, young and newly married to Albert, the subject of endless speculation. Is she too controlled by him? Does she meddle too much in politics? The truth hangs somewhere in the fog outside, but here in the parlour it doesn't matter. The act of discussing is the entertainment itself. Mainstream historical reminder. During Victoria's reign, etiquette became almost a religion for the upper classes. There were manuals, thick ones, detailing how to address people, how to fold napkins, how to sit, how to breathe without scandal. Okay, maybe not the breathing part, but you get the point. Life at the top meant never letting your mask slip. One wrong gesture, and you could tumble down the ladder of respectability. You linger a while, listening. The rhythm of this room is slower than the pounding of factories, but it's just as relentless. Every nod, every laugh, every sip of tea is part of the performance. You realize that wealth here is as much about theatre as it is about possessions. Historians still argue whether these gatherings truly mattered in shaping Victorian society or whether they were just empty rituals. But you sense that in a world obsessed with appearances, the rituals were reality. The tea, the gossip, the piano recitals, they weren't distractions from power. They were power, woven delicately into everyday life. The hour grows late and the drawing room begins to thin. Guests drift toward carriages waiting outside, their cloaks wrapped tight against the fog. The clatter of hooves echoes into the night as servants extinguish lamps one by one. The house grows quiet again, its grandeur dimmed until the next performance. You step back onto the London street where coal smoke curls through gaslight. Behind you, the aristocrats retreat into dreams of tomorrow's gossip. Ahead of you, the city waits with harsher truths, the contrast between velvet drawing rooms and ragged alleys as sharp as a blade. You take one last look at the glowing windows before turning away, knowing the laughter inside depends on silence outside. The divide between rich and poor stretches like the Thames itself, winding, unbridgeable and ever-present. And you, walking through both worlds, carry the strange weight of knowing how they overlap, how sugar cubes and soot, silk and rags, all belong to the same Victorian tapestry. You step away from the glittering drawing rooms and toward a building that hums with a very different kind of energy. The light here is dimmer, the air colder, the smell sharper. You've found yourself at the gates of a workhouse, and the moment you cross the threshold, you feel a chill that has nothing to do with weather. This is where the poorest of the poor end up, and unlike the aristocrats' tea parties, no one here is gossiping over sugar cubes. They're just trying to survive. The entrance hall is stone, bare and echoing. A porter glares at you, his keys jangling like chains. Rules are posted on the wall in blocky black letters. Silence during meals, no fraternization between men and women, obedience in all things. The message is clear. Once you enter here, you're not a guest. You're a prisoner of poverty. You imagine yourself checking in for a room, only to realize it comes with no Wi-Fi, no Netflix, and way too much despair. A family arrives at the same time as you. A mother with hollow cheeks clutches her 2 children, while the father hangs his head low, ashamed. Here's a mainstream historical fact. The 1834 Poor Law Amendment forced the destitute into workhouses if they wanted relief. Outdoor aid, receiving help while staying in your own home, was largely abolished. The logic was cruel but calculated. Make workhouses so unpleasant that only the truly desperate would enter. In other words, welfare by way of punishment. You follow the family inside. Immediately they're separated. Men to one side, women to another, children elsewhere. The mother's hand slips from her son's, his small fingers grasping air. The sound of the boy's cry echoes down the corridor, and it tugs at you harder than any lecture about social policy ever could. You're witnessing a system designed to fracture, not to heal. The dormitories are cold and sparse. Rows of narrow beds line the walls, each with a thin blanket that looks more like a dishcloth than bedding. You see men lying stiffly, eyes fixed on the ceiling, while others mutter into the dark. The women's side is quieter, though the silence feels heavier, as if it's been imposed. The children's ward has little more than wooden benches and straw-stuffed mattresses. The walls seem to sigh with weariness. Meals are served in a vast hall. Bowls of watery gruel slide down the line. A ladle slaps against wood, spilling more water than oats. Quirky tidbit. In some workhouses, the gruel was so thin it earned the nickname wallpaper paste. One man jokes weakly that if you held the bowl up to the light, you could see tomorrow through it. His table mates don't laugh. They're too tired. You spoon some to your lips and almost gag. It tastes like sadness boiled in lukewarm water. But no one here complains aloud. Complaints could mean punishment, and punishment could mean worse tasks, stone breaking, oakum picking, or treadmill walking. Yes, treadmills. Not the sleek calorie burners at your gym, but giant wooden wheels you climb endlessly, producing nothing except misery. Historians still argue whether this was punishment disguised as work or work disguised as punishment. Either way, the people forced to trudge up those wooden steps didn't care about semantics. Oakum picking is another torment, separating tarred fibres from old ship ropes with bare hands until your fingers bleed. You pass a room where men and women sit hunched, their piles never shrinking. The smell of tar is thick, clinging to your clothes as if poverty wants to mark you forever. A woman coughs into her sleeve and you see bloodstains bloom. Tuberculosis haunts these walls, stalking silently. At night, the sounds echo, snores, coughs, the muffled weeping of someone who can't hold it in any longer. You lie in your borrowed bed, staring into the dark, and realize how easy it is to lose yourself in this place. The monotony strips you down until you're not a person anymore, just a body following rules. You feel a pang of gratitude for your own bed waiting somewhere in your future, soft, private, safe. The next day, you watch the routine unfold. The bell clangs. People shuffle to their tasks. The same meals, the same chores, the same silence. It's like living inside a clock that only ticks misery. And yet, even here, sparks of humanity flicker. Two boys whisper jokes when the overseer isn't watching. One elderly man shares his crust of bread with a weaker companion. A woman hums faintly while scrubbing laundry, her voice trembling but alive. You realize people will always carve out moments of rebellion, even in cages. Now, a lighter absurdity. One of the workhouse rules bans laughing during meals. Yes, laughing. Apparently, joy is too disruptive to the system. So, naturally, you overhear a boy let out a sudden giggle when his spoon clatters. The overseer scowls, but the sound has already rippled through the hall like a spark. For just a second, everyone remembers they're human. Mainstream fact again. Charles Dickens famously exposed the horrors of workhouses in his writings, especially through Oliver Twist. His words shocked polite society, though historians still argue whether they sparked reform or merely entertained the middle class with tales of the poor. Either way, the workhouse became a symbol of cruelty wrapped in good intentions. You walk through the courtyard, where prisoners of poverty break stones into smaller stones, which are then piled into larger heaps of smaller stones. It's absurd, the definition of make work. You imagine explaining this to, someone today. What's your job? Oh, I smash rocks until they look like smaller rocks. A grim career path. unless you're a geologist with very low standards. At the far end, you glimpse the infirmary, beds crammed together, the smell of carbolic acid and sickness. Nurses move briskly, though supplies are scarce. One man moans with fever, another child coughs until her body shakes. The workhouse isn't built for healing, it's built for containment. Yet even here you see kindness, an old woman stroking her neighbour's hand, whispering comfort. Humanity, stubborn as ever, refuses to die. Historians still argue whether the workhouse was effective at reducing poverty or whether it simply shifted the suffering behind stone walls where polite society didn't have to look. Standing here, you know your answer. Poverty didn't vanish. It just got hidden, out of sight, out of mind. As dusk falls, you step outside again. The air tastes fresher after the stifling halls, though it's tinged with coal and fog. Behind you, the workhouse looms, its windows glowing faintly. It's a fortress of rules and routines, of gruel and silence, of fractured families and broken spirits. You realize that for all the wealth in the drawing rooms you visited earlier, this place is the shadow they cast. Both belong to the same city, the same era, the same queen. You walk away slowly, footsteps crunching over gravel, carrying the echo of weeping children and the scrape of stones behind you. The aristocrats sip tea, the poor swallow despair. Both are part of the same story, stitched together like uneven seams in a threadbare quilt, and you, caught between, are left with the weight of it all. You leave the workhouse behind, its echoes still clinging to you like a damp coat, and head toward a place that smells of oil, ozone, and a faint tang of curiosity. Tonight, you're stepping into the Victorian fascination with science, a world where the line between discovery and spectacle blurs so completely that you're never quite sure if you're watching history or a circus. It begins with the hum of a telegraph wire stretched above your head. You hear the faint click-click of signals being sent down the line, a staccato rhythm that somehow means entire sentences racing across miles. You can't help but marvel. Before this, news travelled as fast as horses could gallop. Now words fly invisibly through wires, reaching cities faster than a carriage could clear its first toll gate. A mainstream fact. Samuel Morse's system of dots and dashes became the backbone of long-distance communication, and Britain quickly wove telegraph wires across its empire like veins pumping lifeblood. For Victorians, it must have felt like magic. For you, it's almost like hearing the first pings of Wi-Fi connecting. As you walk into a demonstration hall, you find yourself in the middle of a crowd watching a man crank a device attached to a battery. Sparks leap, blue and angry, snapping in the air. The audience gasps, children press forward, and one elderly lady faints dramatically, though you suspect she's fainted before, probably for attention. The scientist, beaming through a soot-streaked face, announces, "This is the future. Electricity, tamed and harnessed." Quirky tidbit. Victorians once believed electric currents could cure nearly anything. Advertisements promised electric belts, electric hairbrushes, even electric corsets. Imagine strapping on a battery-powered girdle and telling your friends it's for wellness. You'd either shock yourself into good posture or invent a whole new dance cross. A's. Historians still argue whether Victorians truly embraced science for progress or for profit. Were they chasing truth or chasing spectacle? You lean toward both. Science here is as much showmanship as scholarship. Every lecture is a performance, every invention an act in a play where the audience gasps on cue. You drift into a laboratory where jars of strange specimens line the shelves. Pickled frogs, dissected flowers, the skeleton of something that looks alarmingly like a cat with two tails. A young man peers through a microscope, muttering about cells, while another scribbles equations on a chalkboard so furiously the chalk snaps. The room smells of ink, iodine and ambition. You realize this is the cradle of discoveries that will reshape medicine, physics and biology. Yet science here isn't confined to labs. Out in the streets, trains thunder across newly laid tracks, iron horses pulling carriages at speeds that once seemed impossible. You step aboard one and feel the ground shake as it lurches forward. Passengers clutch their hats, ladies squeal, and someone mutters that the world is moving too fast. You grin because you know the world is only just getting started. A gentleman beside you whispers conspiratorially, "They say if you go too fast, your organs might shift inside your body." You bite your tongue to keep from laughing. Rumours like these raced as quickly as the trains themselves. The fact that you're still in one piece proves them wrong, though you admit your stomach flips a little as the countryside blurs. Mainstream fact: the expansion of the railway network in the Victorian era shrank Britain, linking cities and fueling trade. What once took days now took hours. Coal, textiles, people, all moved with unprecedented speed. It's no exaggeration to say railways redefined time itself. You step off at a bustling station where posters shout about the Great Exhibition of 1851. Curiosity pulls you toward Hyde Park, where the Crystal Palace rises like a shimmering mirage. This colossal structure of glass and steel feels like stepping into the future. Inside, aisles stretch endlessly, filled with inventions, gleaming machines, exotic goods from colonies, even the world's largest diamond glittering under lights. People gawk, pointing like children at a fair. It's part science, part empire, part bragging rights. Quirky tidbit. One exhibit featured the so-called Tempest Prognosticator, a weather-predicting device powered by leeches. Yes, leeches. They were placed in glass bottles, and their restless movements supposedly signalled approaching storms. You picture some poor Victorian scientist seriously explaining, "Trust me, these slimy guys know when it's going to rain." Historians still argue whether Victorians were gullible or just delightfully imaginative. Wandering further, you overhear heated debates. Some insist science is the key to human progress, while others fear it's meddling with forces best left alone. You pass a man clutching a Bible, railing against Darwin's theories, while another insists evolution is the natural order revealed. The clash between faith and science hums louder than any machine in the hall. Mainstream fact: Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species shook Victorian society to its core when published in 1859. Suddenly, humanity wasn't divinely unique. It was part of a messy chain of natural selection. You imagine the dinner conversations that followed, half awe, half outrage, with plenty of finger-pointing across the table. You wander back into the streets and notice how science reshapes daily life. Gas lamps flicker brighter than candles ever did, illuminating alleys where shadows once ruled. Factories adopt new machinery that boosts production, even if it also boosts accidents. Medicine inches forward too. Chloroform is introduced as anesthesia, making surgery less of a nightmare. Quirky tidbit: Queen Victoria herself famously used chloroform during childbirth in 1853, which helped popularise it. Imagine the royal seal of approval. Yes, dear subjects, I inhaled it and it works wonders. Still, science here is never tidy. Historians still argue whether industrial progress lifted more people into prosperity or dragged them deeper into exploitation. The soot in your lungs, the coughing children in factories, the endless debates, they all suggest the answer isn't simple. Progress feels less like a straight line and more like a tangled knot. Yet Victorians adored the spectacle of it all. Public lectures on astronomy drew crowds who gasped at tales of distant stars. Microscopy exhibits let people peer at fleas and marvel as if they'd discovered aliens. You pause at a street show where a man demonstrates magic lanterns, early projectors that cast ghostly images on walls. Children squeal, adults murmur, and you can't help but see the seeds of cinema glowing faintly in the shadows. And then comes a moment of pure absurdity. A salesman hawking bottled phlogiston, claiming it's the essence of fire itself. He waves his arms, insisting it can light hearths without coal. A boy snickers, and you nearly choke back laughter. Spoiler, phlogiston was a debunked theory long before, but that didn't stop Victorians from packaging nonsense if it made a penny. Science, spectacle, snake oil, it all blends together. As night settles, you watch stars emerge above smoky rooftops. Telescopes, once rare, now dot parlours where families peer upward, whispering about comets and planets. The sense of wonder is palpable. For all their soot and sickness, Victorians believed the universe was opening its secrets to two. One spark at a time. You walk slowly, the hum of machinery fading behind you, the memory of sparks still flickering in your mind. You realise science in the Victorian age wasn't just about facts. It was about feeling. Awe, fear, scepticism, laughter, all tangled together in a restless hunger to know more. And you, drifting through this world, carry the strange delight of being both spectator and participant, marvelling as the future takes shape under gaslight. You step out of the smoky lecture halls and exhibition spaces, brushing soot from your coat, and suddenly you're surrounded by colour. It swirls past you in bolts of fabric, in the rustle of silk skirts, in the flash of velvet waistcoats. You've wandered into the Victorian obsession with fashion, and for the first time in what feels like forever, the air smells not of coal and damp, but of starch, perfume, and mothballs. You glance down at your own shoes and feel underdressed already. The first thing that grabs your attention is the silhouette. For women, it's all about the waist, tiny, pinched, almost impossible. You watch as a maid yanks on the laces of her mistress's corset, pulling until the poor woman's breath whistles out like a kettle. The mistress, however, smiles serenely, as if suffocation is just part of the price of beauty. A mainstream fact, corsets were considered essential in Victorian women's wardrobes, reshaping the body into the coveted hourglass figure. Doctors sometimes warned of corset disease, crushed ribs, displaced organs, even fainting, but fashion trumped health 9 times out of 10. You wince sympathetically as another woman sways, her eyes fluttering. She sinks onto a chaise longue with a faint sigh. The family rushes over, worried, but you can almost hear her whisper, "Don't worry, darlings, it's just fashion." You mutter to yourself that passing out from clothing is a level of commitment you'll never rear. Quirky tidbit. Some corsets were so tightly laced they required metal hooks to clamp them closed, almost like putting on medieval armour. You imagine modern gym goers swapping yoga pants for steel-clamped corsets. Welcome to spin class. Don't forget to cinch yourself into unconsciousness first. But corsets are only the beginning. Over them come layers. Petticoats, crinolines, skirts so wide they sweep half the room when their owner turns. You step aside quickly as a lady's dress nearly knocks over a vase. Crinolines, those enormous cage-like structures made of steel hoops, balloon gowns outward until women look like walking bell tents. Mainstream fact, in the 1850s, crinolines became wildly popular, though they were notoriously dangerous. Women caught fire when skirts brushed against open flames, or got wedged in doorways like oversized furniture. Historians still argue whether crinolines empowered women by making bold fashion statements or trapped them further in impracticality. You sidestep one such gown as its owner glides past, her skirts whispering like sails in the wind. She looks elegant, but you can't help imagining her trying to fit into a cramped carriage. Spoiler, she won't. For men, fashion is a little more restrained, but no less particular. You see gentlemen in tailored frock coats, top hats gleaming like stovepipes, and trousers cut neatly. Their beards and sideburns are groomed to perfection, some waxed into points sharp enough to open envelopes. You overhear one man boasting about his tailor on Savile Row, while another brags about his imported silk cravat. It's subtle competition, but competition nonetheless. Who has the shiniest boots? whose waistcoat buttons strain with the most prosperity, and hats, always hats, bowler hats for the practical, top hats for the ambitious, bonnets for ladies, caps for workers. You notice that in Victorian tie, your headgear is almost as important as your head itself. One quirky tidbit: women sometimes stuffed their bonnets with fresh flowers or even small taxidermy birds. Yes, actual stuffed birds perched on heads. Imagine sipping tea while a sparrow stares lifelessly from your neighbour's bonnet. Fashion, my friend, has no mercy. Historians still argue whether Victorian fashion was primarily about modesty or display. On one hand, gowns covered women from neck to ankle, gloves shielding even fingers from scandalous exposure. On the other, dresses flaunted wealth with expensive fabrics and embroidery, while men's tailored suits declared prosperity. Modesty or vanity, likely both, stitched together with a very tight seam. You step into a tailor's shop and hear the snip of scissors, the hum of needles pulling thread through cloth. Bolts of fabric line the walls, wool, silk, cotton imported from colonies. A seamstress bends over a half-finished gown, her hands flying. In the corner, a boy polishes boots until they gleam like mirrors. The air smells of starch and candle wax, punctuated by the faint hiss of an iron. It's industry, yes, but also artistry. Clothes here are more than coverings, they're social armour. Another scene unfolds at a bustling department store, one of the new palaces of commerce like Whiteley's or Harrods. Crowds swarm inside, marvelling at the abundance. Gloves stacked by the dozen, ribbons in every shade, ready-made suits for those who can't afford bespoke tailoring. A lady picks up a bolt of lace, sighs theatrically at the price, and then buys it anyway. A clerk hurries to wrap it, bowing as if she were royalty. The thrill of shopping itself is becoming a pastime, a way for people to display taste and status. Mainstream fact: the rise of department stores in the mid-19th century transformed consumer culture, making fashion accessible to more than just the elite. These stores offered fixed prices, removing the need for haggling, and they introduced concepts like seasonal sales. Sound familiar? Yes, the Victorians invented our Black Friday frenzy. Outside, you encounter street sellers hawking second-hand clothes, some barely hanging together. Rag pickers dig through heaps of discarded garments, reselling what they can. For the poor, fashion is less about trends and more about survival. A patched coat keeps you warm, even if it makes you look like you wrestled a scarecrow. But even here, people find ways to express themselves. A ribbon tied just so, a jaunty cap angle. It's fashion on a budget, and it matters. And then comes laundry day, which Victorians knew all too well. You pass backyards strung with wet linens, steam rising from copper tubs where women scrub until their knuckles crack. Soap bites at the skin, water splashes everywhere, and still the stains never quite vanish. Fashion might glitter in the drawing rooms, but it leaves sweat and starch for someone else to wrestle. Quirky tidbit: starch wasn't just for collars, it was also used to stiffen entire skirts, making them rustle dramatically as women walked. The louder the swish, the more respectable the lady. Picture a group of Victorian women sweeping into a parlour, skirts hissing like snakes. Subtle? Not at all. Effective? Absolutely. You wander through a ballroom now, where fashion performs its most dazzling act. Candlelight glitters on jewels, violins sing, and skirts swirl in dizzying arcs. Gentlemen bow, ladies curtsy, and the air buzzes with perfume and sweat. A young woman in a blue gown catches her heel on her crinoline and nearly topples, saved at the last moment by a laughing partner. You grin. It's proof that even the most glamorous outfits come with pratfalls. Historians still argue whether fashion oppressed Victorian women or gave them power. On one hand, the corset and crinoline restricted movement, forcing dependence. On the other, a well-dressed woman commanded attention and influence in ways plain dress might not allow. You shrug, because standing here you see both truths swirling together like silk and lace. The night wanes and the ballroom empties. You watch carriages roll away, wheels crunching on gravel. The gowns vanish into darkness. The top hats disappear into fog. What remains is the faint rustle of fabric in your memory, the clink of teacups, the sting of corset laces. Fashion in the Victorian age isn't just about clothes. It's about identity, power, spectacle, and survival. It's beauty and absurdity stitched together, elegance shadowed by discomfort, grandeur balanced on the edge of impracticality. And you, drifting between petticoats and polished boots, carry the sense that fashion here is both a mask and a mirror, revealing and concealing in equal measure. As you walk back into the night, the fog swallows the last glimmer of silk. Your shoes scuff the stones, plain but serviceable. You breathe out, grateful you don't have to cinch your waist to the size of a teacup. The fog curls around you like a blanket as you leave the swish of crinolines behind. London quiets for a moment, only to rise again with a deeper, more commanding hum. The sound is not just carriages or factory whistles this time. It's the low, relentless rumble of empire. You feel it in the cobblestones beneath your feet, in the chatter of merchants, in the ink of newspapers spread across every corner coffeehouse. The Victorian world is expanding outward, and Britain paints the map in bold strokes of red. You stop before a print shop window where a great globe sits proudly on display. Red ink splashes across continents, blotting India, Australia, Canada, and swathes of Africa. The shopkeeper leans out the door, puffing on a pipe, boasting to anyone who'll listen. The sun never sets on the British Empire. You smirk softly, technically true, but mostly because the empire stretches so far that somewhere, at some hour, someone is always stuck under the British flag. Imagine bragging that your bedtime is everybody's bedtime. Mainstream fact, under Queen Victoria's reign, Britain became the largest empire the world had ever seen, ruling over nearly a quarter of the globe's land and population. This expansion wasn't just political, it was cultural, economic, and personal, shaping the way Victorians thought of themselves. Empire wasn't a side note, it was the rhythm of their age. You stroll into a dockyard on the Thames, where ships creak under the weight of exotic cargo. Sailors unload crates stamped with names from places you've only seen on maps: Calcutta, Cape Town, Melbourne. The air is filled with smells that don't quite belong together. Spices sharp as pepper, tea leaves dry and earthy, rubber with its acrid tang, and wood freshly cut from tropical forests. Dock workers shout, ropes groan, gulls scream overhead. The empire isn't an abstract idea here, it's tangible, carried in crates and barrels, traded coin by coin. A merchant waves you over, eager to show off his wares, tea leaves curled like tiny question marks, silk smooth as water, ivory polished to a shine that makes you uncomfortable. He brags about profits, about markets opened overseas. You nod politely, though you notice how he never mentions the labour that made these luxuries possible. You imagine hands picking tea under a burning sun, or men carving ivory while keeping one eye out for danger. The empire looks golden here, but you know the shadows stretch wide. Quirky tidbit: Victorians were so obsessed with tea imported from India and China that by the late 19th century they were consuming more than 2 pounds of tea per person annually. Imagine fueling an empire on endless cups of Earl Grey. It's basically colonialism with milk and sugar. Historians still argue whether the British Empire was primarily about trade or about power. Was it profit that drove expansion, or the thrill of domination? Dressed up as civilization. As you watch a group of officials in crisp uniforms oversee the docks, you suspect it's both. Greed and pride tangled together inextricably. From the docks, you follow a caravan of carriages headed toward the East India Company offices. The building looms, imposing and self-satisfied. Inside, clerks in waistcoats shuffle papers, balancing ledgers fat with numbers. They speak of cotton yields, opium shipments, and railway contracts as casually as others might discuss the weather. You realize you're witnessing the empire not as soldiers on battlefields, but as bureaucrats with ink-stained fingers. The conquest of the world is managed from behind desks by men who may never see the lands they claim to shape. And yet, empire enters every Victorian home in subtler ways. You step into a middle-class kitchen where tea brews in a pot imported from India, sugar cubes gleam from Caribbean plantations, and a rug from Persia sprawls across the floor. Even those who never leave Britain live surrounded by reminders of empire. You sip from the tea, and it tastes ordinary, yet behind it lies a chain of ships, contracts, and lives entangled across oceans. A dinner conversation begins, and you linger to listen. A gentleman speaks proudly of his son serving as an officer in India. A lady fans herself while describing a missionary cousin in Africa. They speak with certainty that Britain brings progress wherever it goes, and yet, in the corner, another guest mutters about rebellions, about resistance, about the heavy costs. You hear discomfort crackle under the surface of polite chatter. Mainstream fact: rebellions were part of the empire's story, most famously the Indian Rebellion of 1857, when soldiers and civilians rose against British rule. The event shook Victorian confidence, sparking fear and harsher control. Historians still argue whether it was a mutiny triggered by immediate grievances or a broader war of independence. Either way, its echoes rattled teacups in every London parlour. You walk away from the dinner table and onto a university campus where young men argue fiercely about empire in the quadrangle. One insists it is Britain's moral duty to spread civilization. Another scoffs, pointing out the hypocrisy of preaching liberty while ruling by force. The debate is heated, yet you notice the arrogance beneath it all. They discuss millions of lives as if they were chess pieces on a board. Quirky tidbit: Victorian mapmakers sometimes exaggerated the size of British territories in atlases, shading them in bold red to appear more dominant. Talk about cartographic Photoshop. Nothing says insecurity like redrawing the world to look bigger than it is. You wander into a lecture hall where explorers regale crowds with tales of jungles, deserts, and mountains. One man, sunburned and scarred, describes nearly starving while tracing the Nile. The audience gasps, enthralled, while you suspect he leaves out the less glamorous details: mosquito bites, dysentery, endless mud. Still, exploration was theatre in this age, and audiences couldn't get enough. At night, you return to the docks, where sailors lounge with pints, boasting of adventures overseas. Their tales are half-truths, embroidered with humour and bravado. One claims he fought off a tiger single-handedly. Another swears he outwitted pirates in the South China Sea. You chuckle because you know the real empire is built less on heroics and more on contracts, ledgers, and trade routes. Historians still argue whether the Victorian obsession with empire made ordinary Britons prouder or simply distracted them from struggles at home. You think of the workhouses, the child labour, the endless smog, and wonder if boasting about far-off colonies made it easier to forget local misery. The empire, after all, was as much an idea as it was a reality, a story told to reassure a nation that it was destined for greatness. Yet empire wasn't only about control. It was also about curiosity. Museums filled with artifacts, statues from Egypt, masks from Africa, manuscripts from India became places where Victorians gawked at the exotic. You stroll into one such museum, its halls crowded with glass cases. Behind them lie treasures stripped from other lands, displayed without context. Visitors murmur, pointing as if the objects exist only to confirm Britain's superiority. You sigh quietly. The objects tell stories, but no one here listens to the voices behind them. Quirky tidbit: the Crystal Palace exhibition once displayed not only machines and diamonds, but also live people from colonies set up in mock villages. Imagine paying a ticket to watch strangers act out daily life like exhibits at a zoo. It's both fascinating and unsettling, proof that empire was as much about spectacle as substance. As dawn creeps across the city, you find yourself back at the print shop, staring at the red splattered map. The empire looms like a giant shadow, stretching across seas and continents. To Victorians, it feels eternal, unstoppable. To you, walking through history, it feels fragile, a balloon stretched too thin. You realize empire here is not just territory, it's identity. It shapes how Victorians drink tea, how they decorate parlours, how they argue at dinner, how they imagine their place in the world. It is pride and profit, fear and fascination, arrogance and awe, all bound up in sails, steam, and red ink. You step away slowly, the rumble of empire still thrumming in your bones. Behind you, ships creak, merchants haggle, newspapers shout. Ahead of you, the Victorian story keeps unravelling, pulling you onward like the tide. The rumble of empire still vibrates under your feet as you wander into another corner of Victorian life, one much harder to wrap in polished pride, the contradictions of colonialism. You've just walked out of the bustling London docks, heavy with crates of tea and spices, only to step into a smoky hall where men in waistcoats debate loudly, their words bouncing like billiard balls against polished wood. Their voices are full of confidence, too much confidence, as they discuss Britain's civilizing mission. You roll your eyes before they finish the first sentence because you can hear the arrogance in every syllable. A rotund gentleman puffs on a cigar and declares that Britain is lifting the savage races into light. Another nods solemnly, tapping ash into a silver tray, and insists that schools, churches, and railways are gifts too precious to be refused. You want to tap them on the shoulder and whisper, "Did it ever occur to you that not everyone asked for your help?" But of course you don't. They wouldn't listen. Mainstream fact: the Victorians often justified imperial expansion with what they called the white man's burden, a supposed duty to civilize non-European peoples. Missionaries carried Bibles, merchants carried contracts, and soldiers carried rifles, all wrapped in the language of benevolence. Yet the reality was far from kind. You step outside, needing air, and suddenly you're in Calcutta, the heart of British India. The city buzzes with contradictions. Grand colonial buildings in one street, teeming bazaars in the next. You hear English voices barking orders, while the air smells of curry and incense, not tea and beef. A British officer strides past, his boots gleaming, his face flushed from the heat, while Indian labourers toil silently under the sun, carrying crates, sweeping streets, or pulling rickshaws. The officer doesn't meet their eyes. Nearby, missionaries set up a school under a canvas awning, children reciting verses in English while their parents watch from a distance, suspicion in their eyes. The missionaries believe they are saving souls. The parents wonder what exactly is being stolen in the process. Historians still argue whether missionary schools educated or erased, whether they built bridges or burned traditions. Star ending here, you can feel it's a messy blend of both. Quirky tidbit: in some parts of India, missionaries once tried to replace local music in church services with imported British hymns, only to discover no one showed up unless the traditional instruments were allowed. It turns out colonial control doesn't extend easily to people's playlists. You turn a corner and stumble into a market where British soldiers haggle poorly over spices while locals snicker quietly. The empire may project power, But here on the ground, it's just awkward commerce. Mispronounced words, overpaid coins, mutual eye-rolling. You almost laugh when one soldier tries to buy cardamom and ends up with dried chilies instead. His face reddens and you whisper, "Careful, mate, that's going to burn in more ways than one." Back in Britain, meanwhile, the story is being rewritten in drawing rooms and parlours. Pamphlets circulate boasting of progress in the colonies. Railways built, crops expanded, trade booming. Conveniently left out are the uprisings, the famines, the exploitation. Mainstream fact: British policies in India, including the emphasis on cash crops like cotton, contributed to devastating famines in the 19th century. Millions died while warehouses overflowed with grain destined for export. Historians still argue whether this was mismanagement or calculated neglect, but for those who starved, the debate didn't matter. You wander into a London coffee house where artists and intellectuals argue over empire. One man sketches exotic scenes from Africa, animals leaping across the page, while another writes essays condemning imperial cruelty. The debate is fierce, but you notice something. They all speak of colonies as theirs, never stopping to imagine voices from the other side. You sip your coffee and think, Victorians could argue endlessly without ever inviting the people they argued about to the table. A more absurd moment happens when you are tea. And a colonial exhibition in Kensington. Rows of stalls display artifacts, carved masks, woven fabrics, spears. But it doesn't stop at objects. There are people too, brought to Britain to be put on display in native villages. Crowds file past, gawking at living human beings as though they were museum pieces. Children tug at their parents' coats, pointing wide-eyed. You feel your stomach knot. Quirky tidbit. Some Victorians even described these displays as educational entertainment, as if empathy could be learned from voyeurism. Historians still argue whether these exhibitions fostered curiosity about the wider world or simply reinforced stereotypes. Watching the crowd here, their whispers mingling with laughter, you know which way the scale tips. Out at sea, on the far edge of empire, the contradictions sharpen. British naval ships patrol trade routes, ensuring goods flow smoothly, but also enforcing rules with cannon fire when necessary. You overhear sailors boast that they keep the seas safe, though the locals might describe it differently. Safe for whom? You hear rumours of skirmishes along African coasts, pacification campaigns they're called. The euphemism is so thin it almost blows away in the ocean wind. Back in Africa, you step into a missionary outpost. A teacher proudly holds up a Bible translated into the local language, insisting it brings enlightenment. Yet behind the schoolhouse, fields are stripped bare for export crops, and men are pressed into labour for projects they never chose. It feels like a paradox you can't untangle, faith and exploitation knotted so tightly they bleed into each other. And here's another quirky tidbit. Victorian travellers often returned with wildly exaggerated tales of savage rituals, describing everything from cannibal feasts to bizarre dances. Some were fabrications, others misunderstandings. But once printed in new papers, they became gospel to readers who had never left London. You realise Victorian tabloids weren't much different from today's clickbait headlines, just with fewer cat videos. Historians still argue whether empire was sustained by violence or by persuasion. Was it the gunboat or the schoolroom that kept colonies under British control? You suspect it was both. Fear and fascination, force and facade, all blended together into a system that looked permanent but felt brittle. Night falls again, and you find yourself in a London tavern. Dock workers drink beside merchants, voices rising as they debate empire. One grumbles that colonies only cost money, another boasts of fortunes made from sugar and cotton. A third, tipsy and slurring, mutters that if the colonies vanished tomorrow he'd still have to shovel coal at dawn. For the working poor, empire is less a source of pride than background noise, a story told by men in parliament that never fills their bellies. You step outside into the fog, pausing under a lamppost. The contradictions of empire weigh on you. Progress and exploitation, pride and cruelty, fascination and dismissal. The Victorians built their identity on this empire, but you can see the cracks already forming. They brag of civilization while crushing cultures, boast of unity while sowing division, sip their tea without tasting the bitterness at its root. Quirky tidbit for the road. One Victorian essayist once declared that Britain had a divine right to commerce. You chuckle under your breath. That's like declaring a divine right to own the Wi-Fi password. Convenient for you, inconvenient for everyone else. As you walk away, the empire hums behind you, both magnificent and monstrous. The debates swirl in your ears, the contradictions echo in your chest. And you know this story isn't finished. It's just another seam in the sprawling quilt of Victorian life, stitched with red ink and fraying threads. You step out of the smoky tavern where men argued about empire and find yourself drawn toward a softer glow, lamplight spilling from a narrow window, the scent of ink and candle wax drifting into the street. Inside, someone is bent over a desk, pen scratching furiously. You lean closer and the words spill into your ears. Not your words, but Charles Dickens's. This is the age of serialized stories, the birth of novels that make entire families huddle around the fire, waiting for the next installment. You've wandered straight into the Victorian imagination. The room is cluttered. Piles of paper lean precariously, ink stains dot the floor, and a cat, yes, a cat, snores on the corner of the desk. Dickens himself mutters as he writes, eyebrows knitting, mouth twitching as if he's holding entire conversations with his characters. You smile, because you can almost hear Oliver Twist asking for more, or Scrooge grumbling about Christmas. His voice is alive, and the world listens. Mainstream fact: Charles Dickens revolutionized fiction in the 19th century by publishing his novels in serialized form, chapters printed monthly in magazines or as cheap pamphlets. This meant stories reached a wide audience, from working-class readers to wealthy families. People didn't just read Dickens, they waited for him, week by week, cliffhanger by cliffhanger. You step back into the street and suddenly you're surrounded by readers. A group of clerks lean against a lamppost, one holding a fresh copy of the Pickwick Papers. They laugh so hard at Mr. Pickwick's antics that one nearly drops his lunch. Across town in a modest parlour, a family gathers, the father reading aloud the latest chapter of Bleak House. His children lean forward wide-eyed, gasping when their favourite character stumbles into danger. You realise Victorian fiction isn't just entertainment, it's community. Stories stitch strangers together, one chapter at a time. Quirky tidbit: some readers were so impatient for the next instalment that they waited at Londo, then docks for ships from America, hoping to snatch copies of Dickens's stories before they hit local shelves. Imagine fangirls camping out for a Harry Potter release, except in top hats and corsets. You wander further and hear a heated discussion in a coffee house. A critic insists Dickens exaggerates poverty to tug heartstrings, while another defends him fiercely. Historians still argue whether Dickens's novels truly changed social policy, or whether they merely entertained middle-class readers who could weep safely and then return to comfortable lives. But either way, his stories made the invisible visible. Workhouses, debtors' prisons, street urchins all paraded across his pages until no one could ignore them. Yet Dickens isn't the only voice here. You step into a library, its shelves groaning under the weight of new novels. The Bronte sisters whisper from the moors, Charlotte's Jane Eyre giving readers a heroine with both passion and grit, Emily's Wuthering Heights brooding like a thunderstorm. In another corner, George Eliot's Middlemarch sprawls across pages, capturing the tangled lives of an entire town. These voices, often women hidden behind pseudonyms, challenge the Victorian assumption that literature belongs only to men. Mainstream fact: women writers faced prejudice, often using male pen names to ensure their work was taken seriously. Mary Ann Evans became George Eliot. The Brontes published as Currer, Ellis and Acton Bell. Readers devoured the stories, often unaware of the women behind the masks. Quirky tidbit: some Victorians were so shocked by Wuthering Heights' dark passion that they accused the anonymous author of being morally corrupt. Imagine the scandal if TikTok teens discovered the Brontes writing fan-fiction-level drama in 1847. You pause by a lamplight where a newsboy shouts headlines. Another installment of Dickens, but also lurid tales of crime and sensation. This is the age of the penny dreadfuls, cheap serialized booklets filled with horror, crime and adventure. You flip one open and find garish illustrations of highwaymen, empires, and detectives chasing shadows through fog. The paper feels rough, the ink smudges, but the thrill is undeniable. Boys on the street corner trade copies like candy, their eyes wide as they whisper about Sweeney Todd, the demon barber. You shudder and chuckle, so much for wholesome bedtime reading. Historians still argue whether penny dreadfuls corrupted youth or simply gave them an affordable escape. Either way, they spread like wildfire, proving that literature wasn't just for scholars in libraries, but for anyone with a penny and an appetite for thrills. You slip into a theatre next, where the lines between literature and performance blur. Gaslights flicker over the stage as actors bellow melodramas adapted from popular novels. The audience hisses at villains, cheers for heroines, and throws orange peels when the plot drags. A woman beside you clutches her shawl, whispering lines before the actors even say them. Proof she's read the book. It's more than entertainment. It's a dialogue between page and stage, a shared fever dream. Another quirky tidbit: some theatres advertised adaptations of novels before the final chapters were even published, forcing playwrights to invent endings. Imagine watching the season finale of a show when the writers themselves have no clue how the story ends. Victorian spoilers were chaotic. Back in the quieter corners of London, you find poets scribbling by candlelight. Alfred Lord Tennyson muses about the Lady of Shalott, his verses spilling like honey. Robert Browning experiments with dramatic monologues, while Elizabeth Barrett Browning pens sonnets that pulse with passion. Poetry too thrives in this age, though novels steal the spotlight. But literature isn't confined to London. Across the Atlantic, American writers like Herman Melville and Edgar Allan Poe send their works across the ocean, influencing Victorian readers. In France, Victor Hugo's Les Miserables finds its way into British hands, inspiring debates about justice and redemption. The Victorian reader, perched by lamplight, isn't provincial. They're global, hungry for every story they can get. And yet, not all is lofty. You pass a satirical magazine stand, Punch, with cartoons poking fun at politicians, society ladies, even Dickens himself. One cartoon shows a woman in an absurdly wide crinoline blocking an entire street, while another lampoons the pompous speeches of Parliament. Humour thrives alongside pathos because Victorians like you need a laugh between their tragedies. Historians still argue whether Victorian literature reflected society or shaped it. Did Dickens create outrage about child labour, or did existing outrage fuel Dickens's popularity? Did the Brontes give women a new voice, or did they simply echo voices already rising? The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. Literature was both mirror and hammer, reflecting the age and reshaping it at once. As you walk further, you stumble into a quiet parlour where a young woman clutches a well-thumbed copy of Jane Eyre. She reads slowly, her lips moving, savouring each word. Her father scoffs that novels fill her head with nonsense, but she ignores him. For her, this book isn't just entertainment, it's a lifeline, a whisper that her own thoughts, desires and rebellions matter. You smile because you've seen this before, in every teenager sneaking novels under blankets with a flashlight. And then, because life loves its absurdities, you overhear two old men debating loudly in a pub. One swears Dickens is a genius, the other insists he's a hack who writes for the masses. Their argument grows so heated that one nearly spills his ale. You laugh softly. It's the same debate people have today about best-selling authors. Some things never change. The night grows late. You walk the streets where posters advertise the next serial, where boys hawk penny dreadfuls, where families wait for novels like Friends. The city hums with words, with voices, with imagination set, loose. You realise Victorian literature isn't just ink on paper. It's air in lungs, fire in hearts, gossip in coffee houses, laughter in theatres, hope in quiet bedrooms. It's the age's dreamscape, sprawling and messy and alive. And you, drifting through it, carry the echo of Dickens's pen scratching, the Bronte's windswept moors, the gasp of a boy clutching a penny dreadful. The Victorian imagination has claimed you, and you know it won't let go. You drift from the lamplit streets where Dickens's characters still seem to follow you, and find yourself at the threshold of a Victorian parlour. The sound of faint laughter, the tinkling of piano keys, and the rustle of skirts beckon you inside. This is the quieter world of leisure, the rituals of parlours and parlour games, the Victorian way of filling evenings that stretched long before Netflix, Spotify or even radio existed. The room glows with lamplight softened by lace shades. The air smells faintly of beeswax polish and overbrewed tea. Sofas are arranged in a horseshoe, ready for conversation. The wallpaper is patterned with fussy florals, the carpet thick enough to swallow footsteps, and every surface is cluttered with ornaments, porcelain figurines, framed daguerreotypes, seashells carefully arranged on trays. Victorians loved their knickknacks. A bare table was an abomination. You sit gingerly in a chair, half expecting it to collapse under the weight of decorative doilies. Mainstream fact, the parlour was the heart of Victorian domestic life, especially for the middle class. It was where families entertained guests, displayed their respectability, and demonstrated their taste through furniture, art, and etiquette. Parlours weren't just rooms, they were stages where social masks were carefully adjusted. A hostess bustles in, cheeks flushed, balancing a tray of teacups. She sets it down, immediately fussing with the arrangement of spoons as if civilization itself depended on symmetry. Guests murmur their thanks, sipping politely. You watch as sugar tongs click, spoons clink, and biscuits crumble discreetly onto saucers. The ritual is hypnotic. Quirky tidbit. Victorian etiquette books warned against dunking biscuits in tea, calling it slovenly. Naturally, you watch a moustached gentleman sneak a dunk, only to have his soggy biscuit disintegrate into the cup. He fumbles, embarrassed, while his neighbour coughs loudly to disguise a laugh. The room pretends not to notice because in this society, ignoring mistakes is almost as important as avoiding them. The small talk begins. Weather, travel, the Queen's latest appearance. It all flows in careful streams. No one dares plunge into politics or religion unless they want the room to seize up like a broken clock. Historians still argue whether these parlours were stifling prisons of etiquette or vital arenas where middle-class culture took shape. You lean back, watching, and think they're both. Then the games begin. Someone suggests charades and groans ripple through the room. But soon, guests are acting out titles of novels and plays, stumbling awkwardly as the others guess. A lady flaps her arms to mime The Tempest, nearly knocking over a lamp. A man crouches like a dog, barking in his waistcoat while his wife rolls her eyes. Laughter erupts, breaking through the parlour's stiff formality. For a moment, these respectable Victorians are just silly humans again. Mainstream fact, parlour games were wildly popular in this era. Charades, blind man's bluff, consequences, and forfeits, where losers performed amusing penalties. These games allowed restrained Victorians a chance to flirt, joke, and bend rules without outright rebellion. You watch as another game unfolds. The Minister's Cat. Each guest takes a turn describing the minister's cat with an adjective beginning with a new letter of the alphabet. The minister's cat is an adorable cat, one begins. The minister's cat is a boring cat, the next chimes in. By zealous cat, everyone is giggling uncontrollably, especially since the minister himself is present, his face growing redder with each adjective. Quirky tidbit. Some games bordered on absurd. One, called Snapdragon, involved snatching raisins out of a bowl of flaming brandy. Yes, flaming. You picture Victorian children lunging at fireballs for fun and mutter. Well, that explains the popularity of insurance policies. The piano strikes up again, and a young woman begins a ballad. Her fingers stumble slightly, but the room applauds anyway. Music wasn't just entertainment, it was social currency. A woman who could play, sing, or embroider earned admiration and proved her refinement. You realize the parlour wasn't just for relaxation, it was a stage for demonstrating virtues. Across the room, a pair of young people exchange shy glances over a game of cards. Their hands brush as they reach for the same deck, and you catch the spark of forbidden thrill. Parlours may look stuffy, but they also served as discreet arenas for courtship. A dropped handkerchief, a whispered clue in charades, tiny rebellions wrapped in lace. Historians still argue whether Victorian leisure was truly joyful or just another performance of duty. Were parlours places of comfort or pressure cookers of etiquette? You suspect the answer depends on where you sat. For the hostess, endlessly arranging doilies, perhaps exhausting. For the bored teenager, sneaking extra sugar cubes may be cosy. For the young man hoping to catch the eye of a girl during blind man's bluff, thrilling. You notice servants hovering at the edge of the room, silent shadows ensuring the performance runs smoothly. They clear cups, refill lamps, and remain invisible unless summoned. The parlour's warmth, you realise, is built on their quiet labour. It's easy to forget them, and that's exactly the point. As the night lengthens, the games grow rowdier. Someone produces riddles, another reads aloud from a volume of poetry, and a guest demonstrates a magic trick with playing cards. The audience gasps, delighted, though you can see the sleight of hand plain as day. Still, they applaud vigorously because wonder, even faked, was prized in this age. And then comes the inevitable awkward lull. The conversation sputters, the fire burns low, and someone yawns discreetly behind a fan. You know this feeling, the moment at a modern party when everyone secretly wishes they were home scrolling their phones. But here they persevere. The hostess suggests one last game, and everyone rallies. Duty and leisure blur. Quirky tidbit. Victorians sometimes played a game called the Game of the Goose, essentially an elaborate board game with dice and penalties. One punishment involved reciting poetry in a ridiculous voice. You watch as a stern gentleman bellows Tennyson like a carnival barker, and the room howls with laughter. Even the minister joins in, though he still looks salty about the cat game. Finally, the evening winds down. Guests gather coats and cloaks, bowing and curtsying as they leave. Outside, carriages wait in the fog. Inside, the parlour grows quiet again. The fire dies to embers, the piano lid closes, and the ornaments gleam faintly in the lamplight. You sit alone for a moment, feeling the echoes. The parlour is empty now, but you can still sense the weight of performance. These evenings weren't just about fun, they were about proving respectability, reinforcing social ties, and enlarging appearances. And yet, within the stiff rituals, real laughter burst through. Jokes, mistakes, giggles. They slipped past etiquette like sunlight through lace curtains. Historians still argue whether Victorians were joyless or secretly mischievous, whether parlours crushed individuality or nurtured it. Watching the games, the music, the stolen glances, you realise it's both. Victorians wore masks, yes, but sometimes the masks cracked, and behind them, people were still people. As you step out into the foggy night, you hear echoes of laughter, clinking teacups, the flutter of charade gestures. The parlour fades into memory, another thread in the Victorian tapestry, one stitched with lace, tea stains, and the faint smell of flaming raisins. The parlour door swings shut behind you, muffling the last echoes of piano keys, and the night presses in colder, heavier. You follow the sound of coughing down a narrow alley and find yourself standing before a building with barred windows and the faint smell of carbolic acid wafting through its cracks. This is no parlour, no ballroom, this is a Victorian hospital, and just beyond it looms the even darker shadow of the asylum. Tonight you're stepping into the uneasy world where medicine and madness blur, where progress jostles uneasily with superstition, and where human suffering is both studied and often misunderstood. The first thing you notice inside the hospital is the smell: bleach, blood, and bodies. A nurse in starched uniform bustles past, her arms full of linens. The ward is long and draughty, rows of iron-framed beds lined up like soldiers. Patients lie pale and still, some moaning softly, others eerily quiet. Doctors stride between them in black coats, their voices low but firm. You pause and it hits you. This is medicine in an age of transition. Mainstream fact: in the early 19th century, surgery was brutal. Operations were performed without anesthesia, speed being the only mercy. Patients were strapped down, screaming, while surgeons raced the clock. But by mid-century, chloroform and ether arrived, changing everything. You picture Queen Victoria herself inhaling chloroform during childbirth in 1853, lending the practice royal approval. After that, patients no longer had to face the knife wide awake. Imagine the relief, though given Victorian quirks, some still distrusted it, fearing anaesthesia might rob them of their souls. You step into an operating theatre, the smell of iron sharp in your nose. A patient lies on the table, eyes wide with terror. The surgeon lifts a scalpel, but before you can flinch, another doctor presses a chloroform-soaked rag to the patient's face. Slowly the fear melts into unconsciousness. The scalpel descends. Around you, students in tears scribble notes eagerly, their faces pale but fascinated. You realise surgery here is both science and spectacle. Quirky tidbit: chloroform demonstrations once became public entertainment, with audiences invited to watch volunteers pass out dramatically. One show even had a man faint mid-sentence, sending spectators into fits of applause. Medicine as theatre. Only the Victorians could applaud unconsciousness like a magic trick. Historians still argue whether the arrival of anaesthesia truly democratised surgery or merely encouraged surgeons to attempt riskier, more invasive operations. Watching the knife flash in lamplight, you suspect both are true. Relief and danger came hand in hand. You move next into a side ward, an asylum. The walls here are thicker, padded in places. The air feels heavier, as if despair itself lingers. A woman rocks in a corner, murmuring prayers to no one. A man scribbles nonsense on the walls, chalk dust caking his fing. So the attendants watch warily, their keys jangling like a warning. This is not the theatre of progress, it is the theatre of fear. Mainstream fact: Victorian asylums grew rapidly, filled with people society didn't know how to handle. Those with schizophrenia, epilepsy, postpartum depression, or even just inconvenient eccentricities. Women especially were vulnerable. Husbands or families could commit them with alarming ease, sometimes for reasons as vague as hysteria. Once inside, leaving was another matter. You shiver because you can feel how fragile safety was. Here's a quirky tidbit. One Victorian treatment for hysteria involved prescribing rest cures so extreme that women were confined to bed, forbidden to read, write, or even talk too much. It was meant to calm nerves, but often drove patients deeper into despair. You mutter under your breath. Imagine being told the cure for your suffering is enforced boredom. The asylum staff speak in hushed tones. Some believe in moral treatment, kindness, structure, fresh air. Patients are encouraged to garden, paint, or walk outdoors. Others cling to harsher methods, cold baths, restraints, or even leeching. Historians still argue whether Victorian psychiatry was progressive or barbaric. Watching an attendant gently lead one patient to a window while another straps down a struggling man, you realize it's both at once, moments of compassion tangled with cruelty. You step into a room labeled hydrotherapy. Tubs line the walls, steam rising faintly. Patients are plunged into icy water or wrapped in wet sheets, the theory being that shocks to the body could calm the mind. Some emerge trembling but calmer, others emerge shivering, no better, no worse. The line between treatment and torment feels razor thin. Another room contains cabinets of instruments, forceps, scalpels, saws. Among them rests a device labelled electrotherapy. You watch as a doctor applies small shocks to a patient's temples, claiming it restores balance. The patient winces, jerking under the current, and you grimace. Quirky tidbit. Some Victorians swore by electric therapy not just for madness, but for baldness, indigestion, even laziness. Electricity, it seems, was the cure-all of the day. You step back into the ward, where attendants sweep past, mopping floors, doling out bread. A woman hums softly to herself, a melody oddly beautiful, though no one listens. A man stares at you as if seeing right through your soul. You feel the weight of eyes that don't quite belong in this world anymore. Meanwhile, outside the asylum walls, the public whispers. Some fear the insane as dangerous monsters, others pity them as tragic souls. Asylums become the subject of novels, penny dreadfuls, even gossip in parlours. Ordinary Victorians rarely see inside, but they imagine them vividly, sometimes too vividly. The line between reality and rumour blurs until even fiction seems true. Mainstream fact. Reformers like Dorothea Dix in America and John Connolly in Britain pushed for more humane asylum care, advocating against shackles and chains. Their influence spread, though conditions varied wildly. Some institutions embraced change, others lagged behind, their wards echoing with cries. Historians still argue whether these reforms truly improved lives or simply dressed cruelty in softer clothes. Walking through these halls, hearing both sobs and songs, you know the truth lies somewhere in between. You leave the asylum and wander into the streets, where another side of Victorian medicine unfolds. Apothecaries' shops gleam with bottles labelled laudanum, tincture of opium, chlorodyne. People line up for relief, buying cures that soothe pain but mask dangers. Quirky tidbit, laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, was so widely used that even children were dosed with it for teething pains. Yes, Victorians gave toddlers opium. No wonder some called it Godfrey's cordial, also known grimly as the baby killer. You peer in. To one home, where a mother spoons laudanum into her baby's mouth, sighing with relief as the child stops crying. She doesn't know the risks, or chooses not to. Addiction, overdose, collapse, all haunt the bottle, but desperation outweighs fear. Doctors, meanwhile, straddle the line between science and guesswork. Some swear by bleeding, others by calomel, a mercury compound that could poison as easily as cure. Historians still argue whether Victorian medicine advanced despite doctors rather than because of them. You can see why. And yet, progress shines too. The discovery of germs by Louis Pasteur, the antiseptic practices of Joseph Lister, the slow acceptance of hygiene, these begin to save lives. You step into a surgical theatre again, this time cleaner, brighter, carbolic spray misting the air. Instruments gleam, survival rates rise. Medicine is evolving painfully, unevenly, but undeniably. As you leave the hospital grounds, the night air feels sharper. You've seen chloroform masks and padded cells, laudanum bottles and scalpels, compassion and cruelty side by side. Medicine and madness in the Victorian age were never simple. They were experiments written in blood and tears, sometimes brilliant, sometimes horrifying. You walk on, the echo of sobs and scalpels still in your ears, and wonder what future generations will think of your own cures, your own hospitals, your own desperate experiments. Perhaps they too will laugh at your medicines, shudder at your treatments, and argue over whether you were enlightened or ignorant. The air grows colder as you leave the hospital behind, and you feel something shift. Not just the wind, not just the fog, it's an atmosphere, thick and humming, like the city itself has pulled a blanket over its head and whispered, "Shh, they're listening." You follow the flicker of candlelight down a back street and stumble into a room filled with expectant faces, chairs arranged in a tight circle. A table sits in the middle, bare except for a few candles, a bell, and a heavy silence. You've wandered into the Victorian séance, a world where ghosts are summoned, tables tap out secret messages, and the dead supposedly speak louder than the living. The hostess greets you warmly, her voice soft but theatrical. She explains that tonight the veil between worlds is thin, that loved ones long gone are eager to make themselves known. You suppress a smile. There's an undeniable sense of performance here. But the people seated around you are earnest, their eyes wide, their grief palpable. They want to believe, and sometimes that's enough. Mainstream fact: spiritualism exploded in the mid-19th century, beginning in America with the Fox sisters, who claimed to communicate with spirits through rapping noises. The movement spread quickly to Britain, where séances became fashionable gatherings for both the grieving and the curious. Even prominent Victorians attended, from scientists to statesmen, each half convinced they'd hear whispers from beyond. The candles gutter as the séance begins. The medium, a pale young woman in black silk, closes her eyes and breathes deeply. Her hands twitch, her voice quivers, and she begins to mutter names, common names, vague enough to hook someone in the circle. A man gasps. He had an uncle by that name. The room leans forward, and you realize you're watching not just a performance, but a kind of collective yearning. Quirky tidbit: some mediums used glow-in-the-dark paint made from phosphorus to create spirit lights floating around the room. Picture ghostly blobs bobbing about while everyone gasps in awe, never mind that they smelled suspiciously like chemistry experiments. You listen as the table creaks and begins to tilt ever so slightly. Fingers grip the edge, knuckles whitening. The medium moans, then shrieks, her voice dropping into a guttural tone. Someone sobs. It's their late mother, they insist, speaking through the medium. You glance at the table legs and know, tice a discreet foot pressing just so. Trickery? Perhaps. Comfort? Definitely. Historians still argue whether séances were cynical frauds or genuine sources of solace for the bereaved. You realize both can be true. Deception can still soothe. The séance builds to a frenzy. A bell rings without being touched. A curtain flutters though no window is open. A spirit hand appears, glowing faintly. You lean closer and notice the string, yet no one else seems to care. In this circle, belief matters more than evidence. Then, just as suddenly, the candles flare back up, the medium collapses, and it's over. People whisper to each other, clutching hands, wiping tears. Some are comforted, some skeptical, but all are shaken. You stand quietly, the ghost of a smile on your face. Back in the streets, you realize seances aren't the only place Victorians chase ghosts. The entire culture is drenched in fascination with the supernatural. You pass a bookshop window displaying volumes on ghost stories, dream interpretation, even how to recognize omens. Authors like Sheridan Le Fanu and later M.R. James fill pages with spectral figures, crumbling castles, and creeping dread. Readers lap them up, hearts racing under candlelight. Quirky tidbit. Victorians also loved spirit photography. Photographers used double exposures to produce faint ghostly images hovering near sitters. Families treasured photos of themselves with their departed lurking in the background, even if the departed looked suspiciously like the photographer's assistant in a sheet. Historians still argue whether this obsession with spirits was mere entertainment or a response to real cultural anxieties. After all, the Victorians lived surrounded by death, high infant mortality, epidemics, wars. When loss is constant, the promise of voices from beyond feels irresistible. You wander into a drawing room where another séance is about to begin, but this time the mood is lighter. Guests giggle as they hold hands, daring each other not to scream if the table moves. The medium here seems more like a party host, cracking jokes between messages. You chuckle when he claims the spirit of Julius Caesar just advised one gentleman to buy better shoes. Ghosts with fashion tips. Now that's service. Yet not everyone is convinced. You pass a group of scientists, stern-faced, determined to expose fraud. They devise tests, marking the underside of tables, tying mediums' hands, sprinkling flour on the floor to catch sneaky footsteps. Many seances collapse under scrutiny, tricks revealed, and still others continue, undeterred. Skepticism and belief battle endlessly, neither side conceding. Mainstream fact. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes, the ultimate skeptic, was himself a devoted spiritualist, convinced he had spoken to the dead. Meanwhile, his friend Harry Houdini, master escape artist, made it his mission to expose fraudulent mediums. Their friendship dissolved in ghostly quarrels. Imagine Sherlock and Houdini unfriending each other over Ouija boards. Speaking of Ouija boards, you spot one being slid onto a parlour table. The planchette glides as fingers twitch, spelling out words that make half the group shriek. You watch carefully. Subtle pushes, unconscious movements, the collective brain steering the message. Quirky tidbit. Ouija boards were marketed as wholesome family entertainment, like Monopoly, before horror films made them sinister. Victorians saw them as both game and gateway. Outside, graveyards hum with stories. Victorians loved visiting cemeteries, not just for mourning, but for picnics, strolls, even courtships. The dead weren't hidden away, they were part of daily life. You walk among stone angels and ivy-draped tombs, and you can almost hear whispers in the mist. Historians still argue whether Victorian spiritualism was progressive, a new way of grappling with mortality, or regressive, a retreat into superstition in an age of science. You glance up at the gas lamps, at the wires humming with telegraph signals, and realize the Victorians never saw a contradiction. Science and spirits could exist side by side, two halves of the same restless curiosity. You pause at another séance, this one in a grand house. The medium produces not wraps or tilting tables, but full-blown ectoplasm, a gauzy substance supposedly exuded from her body. It drifts eerily in the candlelight until you spot the cheesecloth edge. The audience gasps anyway, more enthralled than suspicious. Humans will believe what comforts them, even when the string shows. As the night deepens, you leave the séances behind, yet the air still feels charged, the fog thicker, the shadows deeper. You half expect a ghost to follow you, not from the other side, but conjured by your own tired imagination. That's the real trick of Victorian spiritualism. It doesn't need to prove ghosts exist. It only needs to make you feel they might. Quirky tidbit for the road. Victorians sometimes tested mediums by locking them in cabinets during séances from which spirits still emerged. When exposed, some mediums admitted to sneaking out through trap doors. Imagine inventing ghost doors just to keep your audience happy. As dawn creeps in, you realize the séances were never really about the dead. They were about the living, about grief, about hope, about the need to believe that love doesn't vanish with breath. Whether fraud or faith, spectacle or solace, the séances gave Victorians a way to whisper into the dark and pretend the dark whispered back. And you, still humming with candlelight and raps, walk onward through the fog, knowing the ghosts of. The Victorian age aren't just in its séances, they're in every shadowed street, every sorrowful memory, every restless dream. The fog that clung to the graveyard now begins to lift, and as you step forward, the air feels fresher, cleaner, carrying the faint scent of cut grass and damp earth. For once, you're not headed into a cramped alley, a sooty factory, or a dim parlour. Instead, you find yourself passing through wrought iron gates into one of the newly designed public parks of Victorian Britain. A wide gravel path stretches ahead, lined with young trees. Lawns ripple out like green carpets, dotted with benches, flower beds, and carefully pruned shrubs. It's a strange shift after nights of séances and smoke. The Victorian city, which so often pressed in on itself with suffocating closeness, finally exhales. Mainstream fact: the mid-19th century saw the rise of public parks in Britain, spurred by both reformers and city planners. With industrial cities swelling and workers crammed into filthy slums, reformers argued that green spaces would improve health, morale, and even morals. Parks like Birkenhead, opened in 1847, became models, inspiring London's own grand spaces, Victoria Park in the East End, Battersea, and later the Royal Parks in new designs. The philosophy was clear: trees and fresh air could soothe where soot and poverty suffocated. You walk down the gravel path and hear the sounds of a Sunday afternoon. Families wander together, fathers puffing pipes, mothers fussing with parasols. Children run in circles, their laughter bright against the low hum of city noise that seeps faintly through the gates. A brass band plays in a gazebo, its notes carrying over the lawns. Couples stroll arm in arm, casting sidelong glances at one another while pretending to admire the roses. The park is both stage and sanctuary. Quirky tidbit: in some parks, rules were posted strictly. No ball games, no dogs, no unseemly conduct. And yet, within a week of openings, boys smuggled in balls, dogs chased. Ducks and unseemly conduct flourished under shady trees. Victorians might have adored rules in print, but they adored breaking them even more. You pause near a fountain where children toss pennies into the water, squealing as they wish aloud. A girl in a patched dress whispers she wants cake. Her brother mutters something about a puppy. The wishes ripple across the water, blending with reflections of passing clouds. You realize these children might never see beyond their crowded streets, but here in the park, for a moment, their world feels wider. Further on, you find a group of men lying flat on the grass, their hats pulled over their faces. Nap time, Victorian style. A woman tuts as she passes them, muttering that such loafing sets a poor example. Historians still argue whether public parks truly uplifted the working class or merely provided reformers with the illusion of moral improvement. Watching the snoozing men, you decide they're not worrying about morals. They're just grateful for somewhere softer than cobblestones to rest. You stop near a rose garden, inhaling the sweet scent that briefly masks the coal smoke residue still lodged in your clothes. A couple sits nearby, the young woman twirling her parasol, while the man stammers through awkward small talk. Parks, you realize, weren't just about health. They were also about courtship. Here, under respectable daylight and surrounded by watchful chaperones, love tiptoed cautiously into bloom. A dropped glove, a shared bench, a stolen glance. It was as daring as a midnight rendezvous in another age. Quirky tidbit. Park benches became notorious as courting spots, so much so that etiquette manuals warned young women not to linger too long lest they attract unwanted attention. You grin because centuries later the bench is still one of history's cheapest date venues. At the edge of the park, you hear the cheers of a crowd. Curious, you follow the noise and discover a cricket match unfolding. White-clad players scurry across the field while spectators clap politely. Cricket was more than a game here. It was a moral lesson wrapped in sport, teaching discipline, teamwork, and restraint. You hear a man explaining to his son that cricket embodies the English spirit. The boy nods solemnly while clearly thinking about chasing butterflies. Mainstream fact: Victorian parks often hosted not only cricket but also rowing, lawn tennis and cycling as these sports gained popularity. They reflected the Victorian obsession with self-improvement, order and physical vigour. Sports, reformers believed, could strengthen both body and character, especially for restless young men. You leave the match behind and wander toward the boating lake. Rowboats glide lazily across the water, couples trailing hands into the ripples. Ducks paddle by, quacking indignantly when children toss crumbs. The lake sparkles faintly in the sun, though you notice the water is murky and suspect it doubles as a mosquito breeding ground. Still, it feels peaceful, a mirror for the sky. Historians still argue whether these parks were truly egalitarian. Yes, they were public, but their design often subtly reinforced class divides. The wealthier promenaded on gravel walks dressed in Sunday best. The poor clustered in corners, their patched clothes marking them as out of place. And yet, here they mingled more than anywhere else in the city. The park was both stage and leveller, both democratic experiment and social microcosm. You wander into a shady grove where a preacher addresses a small crowd. His voice rises passionately as he warns against gin shops and gambling. A few nod gravely, though more are here for the shade than the sermon. In another corner, a temperance society. He has set up a booth, handing out leaflets alongside lemonade. The park is never just about leisure. It's also a pulpit, a platform, a stage for reformers to plant their messages among roses and cricket balls. Quirky tidbit: some parks even hosted open-air lectures and demonstrations. One record tells of a man attempting to sell portable lightning rods during a speech, insisting they'd save families from divine wrath. He demonstrated by waving a stick during a thunderstorm. Spoiler: it didn't end well. Children continue to chase each other past you, their squeals rising higher. One little boy climbs onto a statue only to be scolded by a park keeper in a top hat who waves his cane furiously. Rules again. Parks were policed almost as heavily as streets, with keepers ensuring respectability. No climbing, no shouting too loudly, no running barefoot. And yet, barefoot children scamper anyway, their laughter thumbing its nose at propriety. As the afternoon fades, shadows lengthen across the lawns. Families pack baskets, gathering blankets and children. Workers return reluctantly to crowded alleys. The band plays a final tune, its notes drifting over the grass like a lullaby. The gates close with a groan, and the city swallows its people again. You linger, sitting on an empty bench, listening to the silence after the crowd. You think of the workhouses you've seen, the factories, the cramped dormitories. Parks, for all their rules and contradictions, are a rare pocket of peace. They're artificial, carefully constructed, but real enough to matter. They remind you that even in an age of soot and sorrow, someone believed in the power of grass and sky. Historians still argue whether Victorian parks truly changed lives or merely decorated cities. But you can see the value in the faces of children chasing hoops, in the couples stealing glances, in the weary men sleeping under bar trees. Parks didn't solve poverty, but they offered reprieve, however brief. Sometimes reprieve is all people need to carry on. As the last light fades, you rise and walk back toward the city. The gates creak shut behind you, and the sounds of carriages, vendors, and factories surge once more. But in your memory, the park lingers. A green island in a sea of stone, a whisper of respite in an age that never seemed to rest. You step away from the trimmed lawns and cricket cheers of the park, but the echoes of brass bands still ring faintly in your ears. The next sound that reaches you is sharper, brighter, like glass chiming in sunlight. You follow it, and suddenly you're standing before an impossible sight, the Crystal Palace. A vast greenhouse of iron and glass stretches before you, gleaming in the light as though someone had dropped a piece of the future into Victorian London. You squint, half convinced it's a mirage, but no, the palace is real, and it's bursting with people eager to see the world's wonders gathered under one glittering roof. Mainstream fact: the Crystal Palace was originally built for the Great Exhibition of 1851, held in Hyde Park. Designed by Joseph Paxton, it was a revolutionary structure, over 1,800 feet long, made of prefabricated glass panels and iron beams, assembled in record time. Inside, it housed displays from across the globe: machinery, textiles, raw materials, fine arts. The exhibition drew over 6 million visitors in just 5 months. You join the crowd surging toward the entrance, men in frock coats, women in billowing skirts, children tugging at hands. All flock here, eyes wide with anticipation. Vendors hawk guidebooks, street musicians play for coins, and pickpockets hover like shadows, waiting for distracted tourists. A ticket taker waves you through, and you step inside. The first thing that strikes you is the light. Glass walls and ceilings flood the space with sunlight, turning the entire exhibition into a dazzling greenhouse of industry and art. Palm trees grow inside, their leaves brushing steel girders. Exotic birds flit overhead, confused but unbothered by the throng. You take a deep breath, and the air smells of sawdust, machine oil, and faintly of oranges from a nearby stall. You wander into the machinery section, and your ears fill with the clang and whir of inventions in motion. Engines puff steam, gears turn, pistons hammer. Crowds cluster around a giant printing press as it spits out sheets with miraculous speed. Children stare, mouths open, as a telegraph machine clicks out a message across wires stretched within the hall. One gentleman declares loudly that soon the world itself will be connected by invisible threads. You grin, he's not wrong. Quirky tidbit: one of the exhibition's star attractions was a machine that could print 20,000 envelopes in an hour. Victorians gasped in awe, as if envelope making were a divine miracle. You chuckle, imagining them watching you type a text in 2 seconds and fainting in delight. You move further, and suddenly you're in the textiles hall. Fabrics from Manchester shimmer in endless rows, proof of Britain's industrial might. Next to them are displays from colonies: silks from India, wool from Australia, cotton from Egypt. The colours are intoxicating: deep indigos, fiery reds, shimmering golds. Merchants preen as they explain their wares, though their voices sometimes betray nerves when colonial workers nearby eye them with silent resentment. Historians still argue whether the Great Exhibition celebrated genuine progress or papered over exploitation. Was it proof of human ingenuity, or a parade of empire's spoils? You glance at a case filled with ivory carvings from Africa, beautiful yet unsettling, and the answer seems complicated, as it always is. From fabrics you drift to curiosities. There's a massive diamond from India, the Koh-i-Noor, glinting under glass, surround. Dead by Gawkers, a boy presses his face against the case, whispering that it could buy a kingdom. You think of the kingdoms already broken to place it here. Quirky tidbit: some visitors complained the Koh-i-Noor looked dull, unimpressive under the display lights. Imagine stealing the world's most famous diamond only for people to say, it's not that shiny. You keep moving, passing musical instruments, clocks, glassware, and furniture. A German organist plays a colossal instrument that makes the floor tremble. A French clock chimes melodiously every 15 minutes, driving nearby vendors half mad. American exhibitors proudly display a reaping machine, demonstrating how quickly it cuts wheat. National rivalries simmer beneath the polite veneer, each country eager to prove its genius, each hoping to dazzle Queen Victoria herself, who strolls the exhibition more than once with Albert at her side. Mainstream fact: Prince Albert was the driving force behind the exhibition, believing it would showcase Britain's leadership in industry and science while promoting international cooperation. His vision helped shape the Crystal Palace into not just a fair, but a manifesto of Victorian progress. You hear mutters, though, from critics. Some complain it's vulgar, a temple to materialism. Others say it's overcrowded, dangerous, a tinderbox of glass and bodies. Historians still argue whether the Great Exhibition was a triumph of unity or a circus of contradictions. Walking through, you sense it was both, awe and unease wrapped together in iron beams and sunlight. You stop at the American stand, where a novelty catches your eye, a display of chewing tobacco. A young man demonstrates by spitting theatrically into a brass pot. British ladies gasp, half scandalized, half fascinated. You suppress a laugh. Cultural exports come in all flavors. Nearby, a case of false teeth gleams eerily. One gentleman marvels at their realism, while his companion jokes that soon even the dead will be smiling. Quirky tidbit: Victorians sometimes made dentures from actual human teeth, often sourced from battlefields. You shudder, picturing Waterloo veterans losing more than honour. The day wears on, and the crowds swell. You pass a stall selling guidebooks, each page filled with advertisements for miracle inventions. Self-cleaning knives, collapsible chairs, portable showers. Some are ingenious, others absurd. You realize Victorian consumer culture is already in full swing. If it could be made, it could be marketed. Suddenly, a commotion draws you to the far end of the hall. A demonstration of a steam-powered printing machine draws gasps as sheets pour out faster than anyone can grab them. A boy waves one in triumph, only to drop it, and a scramble ensues as adults pounce. The excitement borders on mania. You grin. This is less an exhibition than a carnival of progress. Historians still argue whether the Crystal Palace represented a peak of optimism or the start of overconfidence. It promised endless innovation, endless empire, endless progress, but the century ahead would test those promises with wars and upheavals. For now, though, the palace gleams with hope. As the sun sets, the glass walls glow orange, the structure itself turning into a lantern. Crowds shuffle out, exhausted but exhilarated. You linger inside, gazing up at the vast roof arching like a sky made of iron. You can almost hear the future buzzing, waiting to spill from every invention, every spark of curiosity. Quirky tidbit for the road: one newspaper joked that the Crystal Palace should stay up permanently as a greenhouse, given how many palms and ferns thrived inside. In a way, they weren't wrong. When dismantled and moved to Sydenham, the palace hosted not just exhibitions, but gardens and even life-size dinosaur sculptures. Victorians never did anything halfway. You step out into the cool night. Behind you, the Crystal Palace glitters, its glass panes catching the last scraps of daylight. Ahead, London waits with all its contradictions: soot and silk, laughter and sorrow. But tonight you carry the glow of the exhibition in your chest, the sense that, at least for a moment, the Victorians believed they had captured the future in iron and glass. The glow of the Crystal Palace fades behind you, and the hum of machinery gives way to a darker, sharper sound, footsteps echoing too quickly in narrow alleys. whispers rising like steam, the faint clang of a constable's rattle in the distance. You've stepped into the underbelly of the Victorian age, where crime lurks in every shadow and curiosity burns as brightly as gas lamps. Tonight you wander into the world of Victorian crime and its obsessions, the murders, the mysteries, the detectives, and the endless fascination with fear. The first thing you notice is the fog. It curls thick and low, clinging to your ankles like a living thing. Somewhere a woman shrieks, though it might just be laughter from a tavern. The uncertainty itself is chilling. You walk faster, boots clicking, until you stumble into a knot of people gathered under a street lamp. They huddle around a broadsheet, the print still damp with ink. Headlines scream, "Another ghastly murder in Whitechapel." The crowd mutters, faces pale and eager. You've arrived in the London of Jack the Ripper. Mainstream fact: in 1888, a series of brutal murders in Whitechapel terrified London. At least 5 women, all living precarious lives on the streets, were killed with such violence that newspapers dubbed the murderer Jack the Ripper. His identity was never discovered, and speculation continues even now. You lean closer to hear the gossip. One man swears the killer must be a foreigner. Another insists it's a doctor with sinister knoll. Edge. A woman clutches her shawl tighter, muttering that no woman is safe after dark. The crowd is equal parts horrified and thrilled. You realize the Ripper isn't just a murderer. He's become a story, a grim performance in which the city itself is both stage and audience. Quirky tidbit: entrepreneurs cashed in immediately, selling Ripper tours even during the murders. Crowds paid to gawk at the crime scenes. Imagine today's true crime podcasts, except you're standing ankle deep in the very alley where the body was found. Grim tourism, Victorian style. You leave the crowd and slip deeper into Whitechapel. The streets here are narrow, lined with grim lodging houses, gin shops, and shuttered stalls. A constable passes, swinging his lantern, his eyes darting nervously. He nods at you, gripping his truncheon as though it might actually ward off the night. Law and order feel fragile here, more like theatre than protection. Historians still argue whether the police were incompetent or simply overwhelmed during the Ripper case. With little training, no forensic science, and endless poverty feeding crime, perhaps no force could have solved it. You sigh softly, thinking how easy it is to mock the past with the smugness of hindsight. But crime in the Victorian age wasn't just about murders in alleys. It seeped into every corner of life. You step into a penny dreadful stall and your fingers brush lurid illustrations. Thieves leaping across rooftops, detectives stalking shadows, criminals caught mid-sin. Readers devour these tales, equal parts scandalized and delighted. Crime became entertainment long before Netflix. Mainstream fact: the Victorian period birthed the detective genre. Writers like Wilkie Collins, The Moonstone, and Arthur Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes, turned crime-solving into an art form. Holmes himself, with his magnifying glass and sharp deductions, became more trusted than Scotland Yard. You can almost hear his voice here, mocking the bumbling constables. Quirky tidbit: Conan Doyle once received letters from readers asking Holmes to solve their real-life problems: missing husbands, stolen pets, suspicious neighbours. Some genuinely believed the fictional detective could outdo the actual police, and honestly, who could blame them? You wander into a courtroom now, a place as much performance as justice. Barristers in wigs declaim dramatically, jurors whisper, and the public crowd the gallery for their daily dose of scandal. Trials become theatre, with newspapers reporting every gasp and fainting spell. One case, perhaps a poisoning, perhaps a forgery, unfolds like a serialized novel. You catch yourself leaning forward with the rest, forgetting that real lives hang in the balance. Historians still argue whether Victorian justice was fair or a spectacle for the masses. Sentences could be shockingly harsh for petty theft and surprisingly lenient for the wealthy. You glance at the judge's stern face and realize the law here is less blind and more blinkered. Outside, the prison looms. You approach its iron gates, hearing the clang of chains within. Inside, convicts shuffle in silent lines, heads shaved, uniforms striped. Some are transported overseas, sent to Australia as punishment and labour. Others toil here, breaking rocks or walking treadmills, endless steps going nowhere. The treadmill, once sold as rehabilitation, feels more like cosmic mockery. You mutter, Victorians really knew how to make misery efficient. Quirky tidbit. Public hangings were still spectacles in the early part of Victoria's reign, drawing huge crowds who treated them like festivals. Vendors sold pies and gin while children sat on shoulders for a better view. It was only later, under pressure from reformers, that executions moved behind prison walls. Imagine carnival rides being replaced by gallows, and you have the early Victorian weekend plan. Yet, crottor. I'm wasn't only horror, it also sparked curiosity, fascination, even amusement. You stumble into a museum of curiosities where wax figures of famous criminals pose stiffly in glass cases. Visitors gape, whispering, pointing. You realize true crime has always been part of human appetite. The Victorians didn't invent morbid curiosity, they just industrialized it. And then, amid all this darkness, a flash of absurdity. A policeman chases a thief down an alley, both slipping on the same patch of muck, tumbling head over heels into a pile of cabbages. The crowd bursts into laughter, hats flying. For one ridiculous moment, crime becomes slapstick. You chuckle too, because even history's shadows sometimes trip on banana peels. But the laughter fades as you return to Whitechapel. The fog thickens, the gas lamps flicker, and fear creeps back in. A woman hurries past you, her shawl pulled tight, her eyes darting. She doesn't look at you, and you don't blame her. Danger here is real, not just sensational. Every corner could hide a thief, a killer, a desperate soul with nothing left to lose. Historians still argue whether Victorian London was truly more dangerous than modern cities or whether newspapers exaggerated crime for sales. The truth is muddled. What you know, standing here, is that fear shaped the age as much as soot and steam. Fear sold papers, filled theatres, and haunted footsteps after dark. As dawn approaches, you leave the alleys behind. The sun rises faintly, casting light across streets littered with last night's chaos, broken bottles, scraps of broadsheets, muddy footprints leading nowhere. Crime is both ordinary and extraordinary here, woven into daily life. It terrifies, entertains, and fascinates all at once. You realize the Victorians lived with contradictions. They feared crime, yet devoured stories about it, condemned criminals, yet treated trials like play. Years demanded justice, yet glorified detectives over police. And you, drifting through their streets, feel those contradictions pulse like the fog around your ankles. Quirky tidbit for the road. Some Victorians believed criminals could be identified just by looking at their skulls, a practice called phrenology. You laugh softly. If only crime were that easy. Excuse me, sir, your forehead says you're a thief. Science may have been advancing, but superstition never let go. As you step back into the sunlight, the shadows of Whitechapel shrink, though they never disappear. The fascination with crime lingers, as stubborn and enduring as the soot on your coat, and you know that long after this century ends, Jack the Ripper and Sherlock Holmes will still haunt imaginations, one real, one fictional, both immortal. The fog of Whitechapel still clings to your coat as you walk away from the whispers of the Ripper, but the city hum shifts. The murmur you hear now isn't crime or commerce, it's voices raised in sharp defiance, voices that don't whisper but ring out across cobblestones. You follow the sound and soon find yourself in a square, its air vibrating with chants, banners and women standing shoulder to shoulder. Their skirts may weigh them down, but their words cut through the air like knives. You've stepped into the movement for women's rights, slow, stubborn, and louder with each passing year. The first sight that greets you is a placard, its black letters bold against the grey sky, "Votes for Women." Another reads, "Justice, not charity." The women holding them are wrapped in shawls against the chill, their cheeks flushed not just from cold but from conviction. Beside them stand men, fewer but present, nodding gravely. The crowd sways with energy, each voice a spark in the growing fire of change. Mainstream fact, Victorian Britain saw the rise of the women's suffrage movement, though the vote itself would not be achieved until the early 20th century. Figures like Millicent Fawcett, Josephine Butler, and later Emmeline Pankhurst pushed D for legal, political and social reforms, often facing ridicule, hostility and indifference. You step closer, listening as a woman takes the makeshift stage. Just a wooden crate borrowed from a grocer. Her voice trembles at first but grows steadier. She speaks of mothers denied custody of their own children, of wives unable to control property, of workers paid half a man's wage for the same exhausting labour. The crowd cheers, fists pumping, parasols waving like banners. Quirky tidbit, hecklers often threw rotten vegetables at suffragists, and some women carried umbrellas tipped with metal just in case. You spot one such umbrella in the crowd tonight, its owner clutching it like a bayonet. Reform and self-defense, neatly rolled into one accessory. Historians still argue whether the suffrage movement gained momentum because of women's growing presence in the workforce or because of shifting political tides. Watching this square, you realize it was both. Women were everywhere, factories, schools, hospitals, homes, and they were done being invisible. You wander toward the edge of the square where pamphlets change hands. One bears the face of Josephine Butler, who campaigned against the Contagious Diseases Acts, laws that allowed police to forcibly examine women suspected of prostitution, often humiliating them. The pamphlet demands repeal, arguing the laws targeted the powerless while ignoring men entirely. You watch as a young woman presses the paper into a passerby's hand, her eyes fierce. This isn't just about votes, it's about dignity. Nearby, another group hands out leaflets for the Married Women's Property Act. Mainstream fact, before reforms in the late 19th century, a married woman's property automatically became her husband's. She had no legal existence apart from him. Her wages, her inheritance, even her children legally belonged to him. Imagine working day, Anne. D-night, only to see your wages handed straight to someone else. Reform finally chipped away at this, giving women some control over property and income. You shake your head, wondering how many women spent lifetimes locked in silence before the law finally blinked. The rally grows louder, and the constables arrive, their boots thudding in rhythm. They form a line, their expressions stiff, trying to contain the energy of the crowd. A woman shouts that silence is complicity. Another waves her banner higher. Tension coils like a spring. For a moment, you're sure it will break into chaos. But then a voice rises in song, clear, strong, unexpected. Others join in until the entire square vibrates with harmony. It's not silence they choose, nor violence. It's song, fierce and beautiful. Quirky tidbit, some suffrage groups actually hired brass bands to drown out hecklers. You imagine a group of women belting slogans while trumpets blare behind them, completely drowning out the boos. Victorian karaoke activism. Later, as the crowd disperses, you follow two women into a cramped kitchen. They sit with tea, exhausted but glowing with determination. One admits she lost her job at a textile mill for handing out pamphlets. Another says her husband forbade her from attending rallies, but she came anyway. They laugh bitterly, sip their tea, and keep planning. Change, you realize, isn't born in grand speeches alone. It's stitched together in small, defiant rooms like this. Historians still argue whether Victorian women's activism was more successful in legal reforms, property rights, education access, or in cultural shifts, visibility, respect. You see both unfolding, laws inching forward while society grudgingly learns to see women as more than ornaments in parlours. You step into another hall, brighter and more formal, where women debate education. Some argue for girls' schools that teach science and literature, not just embroidery. Others push for university access. A pamphlet on the table reads, Girton College, Cambridge, one of the first institutions for women. Mainstream fact, higher education for women in Britain expanded slowly but steadily in the 19th century, though degrees and full rights lagged. The sight of women in lecture halls sparked endless debates about morality, biology, even hysteria. Some men claimed women's brains were too fragile for study. You glance at the pamphlet and mutter, "Tell that to the women who outscored you in exams, mate." Quirky tidbit. One medical journal warned that women who studied too hard risked damaging their reproductive organs. You roll your eyes so hard it nearly counts as aerobic exercise. Victorian science wasn't always the triumph it claimed to be. Back in the streets, you overhear gossip. Some men mock suffragists as unfeminine, caricaturing them with wild hair and shrill voices in cartoons. Others fear they'll upend the family entirely, and yet you also hear admiration, quiet, hesitant, but there. Change creeps not just through rallies but through whispers at dinner tables, through daughters arguing with fathers, through mothers daring to dream for their children. Historians still argue whether Queen Victoria herself helped or hindered the cause. Ironically, the woman who reigned over an empire opposed women's suffrage, calling it a mad folly. You chuckle darkly at the contradiction. The most powerful woman in the world, dismissing the idea of women having power. History, you realize, is never without irony. As evening falls, you walk toward a working-class district where another form of activism stirs. Women gather in sewing circles, not just stitching, but speaking about wages, conditions, safety. Some join trade unions, demanding better treatment in factories and workshops. Their activism rarely makes headlines, but it builds the backbone of future labour movements. You pause watching needle and thread flash in candlelight and think, revolution doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums quietly over fabric. Quirky tidbit. Some suffrage societies even hosted bazaars, selling homemade jams and crafts to raise funds for campaigns. Imagine funding political movements with lemon curd and knitted socks. Delicious democracy. The night deepens, but the voices don't fade. In one square, a woman reads poetry aloud. Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Cry of the Children, her voice trembling with fury at child labour. In another, a group rehearses speeches for Parliament petitions. Across the city, invisible threads connect them all. You realise you're walking through an age where women begin demanding recognition not just as wives or mothers, but as citizens. It's uneven, often resisted, often mocked, but it grows, stubborn and steady. Historians still argue whether the suffrage fight was born of necessity, desperation, or bold vision. You think it was all three. These women lived in a world that told them they were less, and they answered with a chorus of more. As you step away, the last sound you hear is chanting fading into the fog, tired, strained, but unbroken. Their words echo in your ears, not just votes, not just rights, but dignity, equality, existence. You know they won't stop until the walls crack, and you, walking on, carry their voices with you. Proof that even in the age of soot and corsets, the future was already stirring in the voices of women who refused to be silent. The chants of the suffragists fade behind you, carried off by the night air, and the streets of London grow quieter. A strange heaviness settles over the city, as if even the fog itself has grown tired. You sense that you're walking into the twilight of something immense, an era that has marched forward with steam engines and scandals, with novels and noise, and now, slowly, begins to stumble beneath its own weight. This is the Victorian twilight, the long breath before the curtain falls. The first thing you notice is the pace. Where once the city seemed frantic with progress, factories humming, trains screaming, parlours buzzing, now it feels weary. The workers trudge with heavier steps, their shoulders rounded. Even the aristocrats seem quieter, their carriages rolling more slowly as if the horses themselves are exhausted. It is still London, still powerful, still rich, but there's a sense of fatigue running through its veins. Mainstream fact: Queen Victoria's reign stretched from 1837 to 1901, making it one of the longest in British history. By the late 1890s, she had ruled for over 60 years. What began in youthful vigour had grown into an age of both triumph and disillusionment. Industrial growth, empire expansion, and social reforms marked the century, but so did poverty, inequality, and unrest. The twilight years reflected both the glory and the strain. You walk past a factory at dusk. The chimneys still belch smoke, but fewer workers stream out. Machinery creaks as if protesting every movement. The Industrial Revolution's first fires are cooling, its engines aging. Strikes ripple across the city more frequently now, workers demanding shorter hours, better pay, safer conditions. Where once the factory bell rang with unquestioned authority, now it meets defiance. You overhear a man mutter, "We built the empire's wealth, and we're still starving." His words hang heavy in the air. Quirky tidbit: in some factories, workers staged go-slows, deliberately reducing their speed to protest without outright striking. Imagine a room full of weavers all suddenly moving at half pace while overseers fumed helplessly. Victorian passive aggression at its finest. Historians still argue whether these late-century labour movements truly transformed society or simply set the stage for reforms in the 20th century. Watching weary men and women shuffle home, faces pale under Sue, you feel the answer. Change is never instant. It creeps, it protests, it seeds the ground for tomorrow. You turn a corner into a once grand district. Mansions still stand tall, but their facades are weathered, their gardens overgrown. A butler sweeps idly, his uniform frayed. Inside, the drawing rooms no longer dazzle. The chandeliers gather dust. Many aristocratic families are stretched thin, their wealth eroded by global competition and the sheer cost of maintaining appearances. Some quietly sell heirlooms, others rent rooms to wealthy industrialists. The old order wobbles. Mainstream fact: by the end of the 19th century, Britain's aristocracy was declining in influence, while industrial capitalists and middle-class professionals gained power. Titles still glittered, but money spoke louder. Historians still argue whether this shift was smooth evolution or painful decline, but you see both playing out in these dim mansions and bustling factories. You hear laughter nearby, raucous, desperate. It leads you into a music hall, one of the era's favourite entertainments. Inside, performers belt bawdy songs, comedians crack jokes about politics, and acrobats tumble across the stage. The audience roars with laughter, mugs of beer sloshing. It's a release valve for the weary, a place to forget soot and sorrow. Yet even here, the jokes carry bitterness, mocking bosses, mocking politicians, mocking the very empire that demands so much. The laughter is sharp, not light. Quirky tidbit: one performer, famous for comic songs, once had a routine interrupted by a drunken heckler. Instead of silencing him, the audience began throwing cabbages at the poor fellow. The heckler fled. The performer pocketed the cabbage for stew. Even comedy had its practical benefits. Historians still argue whether music halls empowered the working class by mocking elites or distracted them from real change. Watching the crowd roar with laughter, you sense it was both. escape, and rebellion rolled into song. You step outside again, and the night feels older. Posters on walls fade and peel. The empire's victories, India, Africa, Asia, are still bragged about in print, but mutters of resistance filter through too. Colonial subjects rebel, criticize, demand autonomy. The empire isn't crumbling yet, but the cracks widen. You overhear two men arguing at a tavern table. One insists Britain's dominance is eternal. The other warns that no empire lasts forever. Their voices clash until the ale dulls them. Mainstream fact: by the end of Victoria's reign, Britain still ruled vast territories, but challenges were mounting. Wars in South Africa, unrest in India, and rival powers like Germany and the United States threatened its supremacy. The certainty of the mid-century empire began to waver. You wander into a newsroom where typewriters clatter and presses thud. Journalists argue over headlines. Should they trumpet Britain's glory or warn of its troubles? The editor slams his fist, demanding optimism. The people want pride, not doubt. Yet a junior writer mutters about Boer war casualties piling up. Truth and propaganda wrestle on the page, just as they always do. Quirky tidbit: one paper famously printed a headline about a military victory before it actually happened. When the battle turned disastrous, the editors scrambled to rewrite, but readers noticed Victorian fake news wasn't so different from yours. You leave the newsroom and wander into a quieter street where an old woman lights a candle in her window. Inside, she kneels before a photograph of her son lost in war. You realize the Victorian twilight isn't just about politics or empire. It's about personal grief multiplied across thousands of homes. Progress may dazzle, but it demands sacrifices, and the cost weighs heavily now. Historians still argue whether the late Victorian years were more about decline or transition. Was it the fading of greatness or the slow birth of something new? Walking these streets, you feel both truths at once. You pass a shop where gramophones hiss faintly, spinning records of music. The sound is eerie, a human voice preserved in tinny echoes. Victorians marvelled at it, both thrilled and unsettled, hearing voices of the dead replayed as if they lingered. You pause, shivering slightly. The age of invention isn't over, but even its marvels now feel ghostly, reminders that the future rushes in faster than anyone can hold it. Quirky tidbit: some families recorded messages of dying relatives on phonographs, replaying them for comfort. Imagine a parlour where a mother plays her late husband's voice every evening. Comfort or haunting? Perhaps both. As you near Buckingham Palace, you hear the toll of bells. Queen Victoria herself is old now, shrunken, draped in black since Albert's death decades earlier. She is still revered, the grandmother of Europe, but she is no longer the bright young queen who once seized the throne. Her grief became the empire's grief. Her mourning stretched across decades, shaping fashion, manners, even architecture. Now, in the final years, she seems more symbol than sovereign, the living embodiment of a long age. Mainstream fact: Victoria's later reign was marked by personal seclusion. After Albert's death in 1861, she withdrew from much of public life, though she remained politically active behind the scenes. By her death in 1901, she was both beloved and criticised. Beloved as a symbol of stability, criticised for her isolation. You imagine the weight she carried: 60 years of rule, an empire stretched thin, a world transformed beyond recognition. Historians still argue whether she was truly a powerful monarch or merely a figurehead riding the wave of industrial capitalism. Either way, she became the face of the century itself, inseparable from its triumphs and its shadows. The city grows silent as you wander homeward. The gas lamps flicker, carriages roll slower, voices hush. The Victorian twilight isn't dramatic, it's weary, drawn out, inevitable. The age that once blazed with invention and ambition now flickers like a dying candle. And yet, as you look up at the night sky, you realize twilight isn't only an ending, it's also a transition, a soft handoff from day to night. The Victorian world doesn't vanish, it reshapes into the Edwardian, then the modern. The soot, the songs, the novels, the ghosts, they linger in memory, in bones, in brick. Quirky tidbit for the road. One journalist reflecting on Victoria's last years wrote that Britain felt like an old lion, scarred but still roaring in its dreams. You smile at the image. Tired though it was, the Victorian age still dreamed of roaring, even as its paws ached. You walk on, the city heavy around you, carrying the twilight in your chest. You know the end is near, not just for a queen, but for the world she came to symbolize. The twilight you felt settling over the city has thickened into something heavier, an atmosphere that tastes of endings. The streets are quieter now, the fog gentler, almost reverent. Somewhere, a clock chimes slowly, as if marking not just the hour, but the fading heartbeat of an era. You walk toward Windsor, drawn by the hush of history in the making. Tonight you are witness to the last breaths of the Victorian age, the end of the reign that has shaped everything you've seen. The castle looms against the grey sky, its towers rising sombre and still. Guards pace with solemn steps, their boots striking the stones in rhythm, but even they seem subdued. Inside, the corridors are hushed, servants moving with muted urgency. Curtains are drawn tight, fires burn low. You feel the weight of waiting, the kind of silence that stretches just before grief becomes official. Mainstream fact. Queen Victoria died on January the 22nd, 1901, at the age of 81. Her reign had lasted 63 years, longer than any monarch before her. Her death marked not only the passing of a sovereign, but the symbolic close of an age that bore her name. You step into a dim chamber where courtiers and family members gather. The Queen lies frail, her body shrunken, her once bright eyes dimmed to embers. She wears black, as she has for decades since Albert's death, the eternal widow. Around her, children and grandchildren murmur softly, princes, princesses, future kings and queens of Europe. She is, after all, the grandmother of Europe, her bloodline woven into nearly every royal house. A doctor leans close, whispering words no one wants to hear, but everyone expects. The Queen stirs faintly, her lips moving, perhaps whispering Albert's name one last time. You think of her endless mourning, her devotion carved into every day since 1861, and you wonder if this moment feels less like death and more like reunion. Quirky tidbit. Victoria left detailed instructions for her funeral, including being buried with a plaster cast of Albert's hand and several sentimental objects. A dressing gown, a lock of hair, even a photograph of her faithful Scottish servant John Brown. She carried her affections stubbornly into the grave. Historians still argue whether Victoria's long mourning weakened or strengthened her image. Some say her retreat made the monarchy irrelevant. Others claim it made her a symbol of constancy in a changing world. Watching her now, frail but unyielding, you see both. A queen who withdrew yet endured, who resisted change but also embodied it. The moment comes quietly. The queen exhales one last breath, her chest falling still. Around her, the family bows heads, muffled sobs breaking the silence. Outside, the castle bells begin to toll. London and then the world will soon hear the news. Victoria is gone. The age is over. You step outside into the cold night. The air feels different, emptier, heavier, but also poised. Crowds gather in hushed clusters, waiting for word they already sense. Gas lamps flicker over pale faces, men remove hats, women clasp hands. When the tolling reaches them, a wave of silence washes over the streets. Even the horses seem to pause. The empire holds its breath. Mainstream fact: Victoria's funeral was one of the largest of its time, attended by royals and dignitaries from across Europe. Her coffin was draped not in black, but in white, at her request, symbolizing not despair, but peace. She was laid to rest beside Albert at Frogmore, finally reunited with the husband she mourned for 40 years. You imagine the funeral procession, the coffin carried by sailors, the streets lined with mourners, banners lowered, church bells tolling across the nation, trains carry her body across the countryside, crowds waiting at every station in silence. It is not just a queen being buried, it is an entire century being folded into history. Historians still argue whether the Victorian era should be remembered as an age of progress or oppression, brilliance or hypocrisy. You've walked its streets, breathed its soot, heard its laughter and sobs, and you know the answer is both. It was an age of contradictions, dazzling exhibitions and deadly workhouses, suffragists and scandals, scientific triumphs and seances. Its glory and its shadows are inseparable, stitched together into a single, sprawling tapestry. Quirky tidbit: when Victoria died, some newspapers printed their editions bordered entirely in black. Newsstands looked like walls of mourning, each page itself a memorial. Even advertising copy was printed solemnly, as though toothpaste or umbrellas themselves had paused to grieve. The city begins to stir again, even in grief. Carriages clatter as messages race, newspapers scramble, bells toll from every steeple. Change never pauses, even for mourning. Already people whisper of Edward VII, the new king, the new age. The Edwardian dawn waits impatiently on he horizon, ready to sweep away lace doilies and gas lamps with jazz, motors and aeroplanes. But for tonight, the world belongs to Victoria's shadow. You walk through the streets one last time, past factories that still groan though their smoke thins, past parlours where women still laugh over charades, past pubs where men argue about empire, past schools where children still hunch over slates. The age hasn't vanished. It lingers in habits, in bricks, in bones, but you feel the shift, the tilt towards something new. The fog rises thicker now, curling like a shroud. You pause at the Thames, its black water carrying reflections of lamps and bridges. This river has been witness to it all: coronation, cholera, Crystal Palace, Ripper murders, suffragist chants, Victoria's funeral. It flows on, indifferent, carrying history like silt. You breathe deeply, letting the cold air settle in your lungs, as if inhaling the last breath of the Victorian age itself. And then, gently, you let it go. The story you've walked through is finished, though its echoes will linger for centuries. You've seen an empire rise, cities choke, factories roar, parlours glitter, children starve, women fight, ghosts whisper, novels bloom, detectives deduce, lovers court, criminals prowl, queens reign, and queens die. The Victorian age was never one thing, it was everything, all at once, crowded, messy, alive. You close your eyes, and for a moment you hear it all at once. The clang of machinery, the cries of street vendors, the scratch of Dickens's pen, the chants of suffragists, the laughter of parlours, the sobs of asylums, the hiss of steam, the toll of bells, a cacophony of a century fading into silence.